My wife and I are no longer suited to one another." James Fairfield's voice carried across the ballroom like a blade, clean, cold, and utterly final. 200 guests fell silent. Mary Pembroke stood at the edge of that silence, her spine straight, her gloved hands folded, and her heart breaking in a way no one in that gilded room could see. She had spent 8 years building this man's world. She did not know in that moment that a letter sealed with the Queen's royal crest was already riding hard toward Fairfield Manor, and that everything James Fairfield had just destroyed was about to become the foundation of something he could never touch. If a woman's quiet strength has ever moved you, stay with us. Subscribe and tell us what city are you watching from tonight. The ballroom at Fairfield Manor had never looked more magnificent. 100 candles burned in the iron chandeliers overhead, casting gold light across the polished floors, and the 200 guests who filled every corner of that great room. It was the 15th of October, 1815. James Fairfield's 37th birthday, and the county of Somerset had turned out in full to celebrate the man who owned more land than any other gentleman within 40 miles. Mary Pembroke Fairfield stood near the east window, a glass of untouched wine in her gloved hand, watching her husband work the room. She had always been good at watching. 8 years of marriage had made her an expert in the particular art of observing James Fairfield, the way his shoulders squared when he wanted to impress someone, the way his laughter came half a beat too late when he was performing, rather than feeling the way his eyes swept a room, looking for the person most worth being seen by. Tonight those eyes kept finding Catherine Ashworth. Catherine was 23. She was the daughter of a baronet from the neighboring county, and she laughed at everything James said with the breathless enthusiasm of someone who had not yet learned that charm and character were two entirely different things. She wore a gown the color of cream roses. Her hair was dressed with ribbons Mary recognized as the ones James had purchased in Bath 3 weeks ago on a trip he had taken alone, he said, for estate business. Mary set her wine glass on the windowsill. She had known about Catherine for 4 months. Not from gossip, not from a servant's whispered warning. She had known because she knew James, because she had studied him for 8 years, the way a naturalist studies a creature in its native habitat with patient attention and no remaining illusions. She had not confronted him, not because she was afraid, because she had been waiting to understand what she herself wanted. That question, "What do you want?" Mary had lived in the center of her chest for so long it had grown roots. She had planted it there herself on the night of their 3rd anniversary, when James had forgotten to come home for dinner and arrived at midnight smelling of tobacco and port, with an apology so practiced it had lost all its edges. "What do you want?" She had spent the years since that night finding out. "Mrs. Fairfield." The voice at her elbow belonged to Lord Ashby, the county magistrate, a man of 60, with kind eyes and a reputation for fair dealing. "You look pale this evening. Are you quite well?" "Perfectly well, thank you." Mary turned a smile on him that cost her nothing. She had been making that particular smile for years. "It is a warm evening." "It is indeed." Lord Ashby glanced toward the center of the room, where James was bending his dark head toward Catherine Ashworth's ear. Something shifted in the old man's expression, a tightening of concern. "Your husband seems in good spirits." "He always is at his own birthday celebrations." Lord Ashby was quiet for a moment. Then carefully, "You have been a great asset to this county, Mrs. Fairfield. The school program you established in the eastern parishes, I heard from Reverend Collins that enrollment has tripled since last autumn." Mary's smile became briefly real. "The women were always capable. They only needed access. You gave it to them. I helped." She straightened slightly. "Women in those parishes were raising children and managing household accounts with no formal instruction. The gap was not in their intelligence. It was in their opportunity." Lord Ashby studied her. "You speak of it with considerable conviction." "Because I believe it." He nodded slowly. "I hope you know," he said in a lower voice, "that your work has not gone unnoticed, not merely in this county." Before Mary could ask what he meant, a footman appeared at her elbow with a silver tray. On it lay a letter cream envelope, red wax seal. The imprint unmistakable to anyone with eyes trained on the social architecture of 1815 England, the royal crest of Queen Charlotte. Mary stared at it. "This arrived this evening, ma'am," the footman murmured. "By royal courier. The man rode from London. He said it required your hand directly." Lord Ashby saw the seal. His eyebrows rose considerably. Mary lifted the letter from the tray. It was heavier than it looked. She did not open it, not yet. She pressed it between her palms and felt the warmth of it, the impossibility of it, and something else, a steadying. Whatever was in this letter, it had come to her. Not to James. To Mary Pembroke. She slipped it into the hidden pocket of her gown, a practical addition she had insisted the dressmaker include over his artistic objections, and turned back to the room. James was moving toward the center of the ballroom, now signaling the quartet to pause. He did this at every gathering, commandeered the moment when the evening was warmest, and the wine had loosened every tongue in the room. He liked an audience when he was performing. He always had. "Ladies and gentlemen." James lifted his glass. His voice was the kind that filled rooms without effort, deep assured, carrying the particular confidence of a man who had never once doubted his right to take up space. "I am grateful beyond measure for your presence this evening. Somerset has been generous to me all my life, and you, every one of you, are the finest people in England." Laughter and agreement rippled through the crowd. James smiled. He waited for the room to settle the way a conductor waits for his orchestra to find silence before the opening note. "I have an announcement to make." Mary felt it before she understood it. A change in the air around her husband, a different kind of tension in his shoulders, a calculation behind his eyes. "My friends." James paused. He looked across the room, not at Mary, not yet, and that deliberate avoidance told her more than his words would. There are times in a man's life when he must speak plainly, even when plain speech is difficult. The room was very still now. "My wife and I are no longer suited to one another." Silence. Not the warm silence of anticipation, the cold silence of shock. 200 heads turned, half turned toward James, half turned toward Mary. She stood exactly where she had been standing. Her hands were clasped in front of her. Her face was composed. Later, those who had watched her in that moment would describe her expression differently. Some said she looked devastated. Some said she looked carved from stone. One woman, Margaret Hollis, who had known Mary for years, would say quietly to her husband on the carriage ride home, "She looked like she had already decided." "We have come to an understanding." James continued, his voice smooth as river water. "A formal separation will be arranged. Mary will be provided for." A small pause on those two words, weighted with the particular condescension of a wealthy man, reminding a room that he was being generous. "I intend no ill feeling. But I believe in honesty, and I believe this company deserves to know, before rumor reaches you, that the situation is as I have described." He raised his glass. "To Somerset. To good friends. To the future." A few people raised their glasses out of social reflex. Most did not. Mary watched her husband drink. Then she reached into her pocket. She drew out the letter. She broke the red seal with her thumb slowly, without hurrying, and unfolded the cream paper. The handwriting was formal, precise, and signed at the bottom, with a name that made the woman standing nearest to Mary make a small involuntary sound. Mary read the letter twice. Then she looked up. James was watching her now, finally, with the expression of a man who has just fired a cannon and is waiting for the smoke to clear. There was satisfaction in his face. There was also faintly the beginning of confusion, because Mary had not collapsed, had not left the room, had not given him the visible wound he had perhaps expected. She folded the letter. She held it at her side. And then she walked to the center of the ballroom. The crowd parted. People stepped back without understanding why. There was simply something in the way Mary Pembroke moved across that floor that made every sensible body in the room yield her the space she was crossing toward. She stopped 10 feet from James. "I appreciate your honesty," Mary said clearly. Her voice carried precisely as far as she intended it to every corner of that room. "Allow me to offer some of my own." James tilted his head, a small smile. "Mary, I received a letter this evening." She lifted it. By royal courier from London. The room absorbed this information, the way dry ground absorbs sudden rain slowly at first, then all at once. It is from Her Majesty Queen Charlotte. Mary opened the letter again and read from it directly. Dear Mrs. Pembroke, it is with great pleasure that I write to inform you of your appointment as Royal Advisor for Women's Educational Reform across the counties of England and Wales. Your program of rural women's education begun in Somerset and now replicated in 11 parishes across 3 counties has come to the attention of the Crown. It is our earnest wish that your work be expanded, supported, and honored at the national level. We await your presence at court at your earliest convenience. She refolded the letter. The silence in the ballroom was of a quality no one present had experienced before. I accept the appointment, Mary said to the room, to no one and everyone. I have already decided. She turned to James. For the first time all evening she looked at him directly. You told 200 people that I am no longer suited to you. Her voice was quiet now, but no less audible. I want 200 people to know that I was never merely suited to you. I was committed to you. I worked beside you. I built beside you. And I built something you never noticed, because you were too busy looking at things that glittered. James's jaw tightened. I do not hate you for this night. Mary tucked the letter back into her pocket. But I will not be provided for. I will not be quietly arranged. And I will not disappear. She nodded once, a slight formal gesture, the kind a queen might offer. Enjoy your birthday, Mr. Fairfield. And then she walked out of the ballroom. Not quickly, not in flight. With the measured, unhurried steps of a woman who had somewhere to be. The crowd parted for her again. And this time, as she passed several people, Lord Ashby among them, turned their backs on James Fairfield to watch her go. Outside, the October air was sharp and clean, and smelled of wood smoke and turned earth. Mary walked down the front steps of Fairfield Manor and stopped at the bottom, pressing one hand against the stone pillar that flanked the entrance. Her legs were shaking. She had known about Catherine for 4 months and had not cried. She had heard James's announcement in that ballroom and had not flinched. She had spoken her piece in front of 200 witnesses with a steady voice and a steady face. Now, alone in the dark, with the cold air filling her lungs, she let her hands tremble. Mrs. Fairfield. A voice, female, unfamiliar. Or forgive me, Mrs. Pembroke. Mary turned. A young woman stood at the foot of the steps, dressed plainly, a leather satchel over one shoulder. She was perhaps 20, with ink-stained fingers, and the alert expression of someone accustomed to paying close attention. My name is Frances Alderton, the young woman said. I am a correspondent for the Somerset Gazette. I was here this evening covering Lord Fairfield's celebration. A pause. I witnessed what happened inside, and I witnessed what you just said. Mary studied her. What do you want, Miss Alderton? I want to know if you will speak to me. Frances Alderton's voice was steady. Not about the divorce, about your schools, about what you have been building for 8 years, while the county talked about other things. Mary was quiet for a moment. Walk with me, she finally said. They walked along the gravel path that skirted the east garden. Mary's garden, the one she had planted herself 6 years ago, the one James had always described to guests as a feature of the estate, without mentioning who tended it. I started with 1 room, Mary said. In the parish hall at Cheddar, 6 women. 3 of them could not write their own names. One of them was 44 years old and had been managing her family's grain accounts for 20 years by memory alone. Frances was writing in a small notebook, walking and scribbling simultaneously. Within 18 months we had 40 women enrolled. I hired 2 instructors women from the village who had some education and a great deal of practical sense, and paid them out of my own income. My personal allowance. Mary paused. James did not ask where the money went. He did not ask because he did not notice. Was that painful? Frances asked. That he did not notice. Mary considered the question with genuine attention. At first. She folded her hands at her waist, walking steadily. Later it became useful. It meant I could work without interference, without someone deciding whether my work was worthy of support before it had a chance to prove itself. And the Queen's letter, I knew it was coming. Mary's voice was quiet. Lord Ashby informed me 2 weeks ago that my program had been brought to the Crown's attention. He asked me how I wished to proceed. I told him I would wait for the official communication. Francis stopped walking. You knew. Tonight when your husband made his announcement, you already knew about the letter. Yes. And you waited. I waited, Mary confirmed. Because the moment needed to be right. Because 200 witnesses are considerably more useful than 2. Francis stared at her. Then she wrote something in her notebook and underlined it twice. Mrs. Pembroke, she said, can I ask you something personal? You may ask. I will decide whether to answer. Were you always this? Francis searched for the word. This certain, or did tonight make you so? Mary was quiet for a long time. The garden was dark around them, and the sounds from the ballroom had faded to a murmur. The music having resumed in that particularly hollow way, music resumes after something has broken the night's spell. I was certain the night my mother died, Mary said at last. She was a capable woman, capable in ways that were never recorded, never paid, never thanked. She managed the family accounts, raised 4 children, nursed a difficult husband through 10 years of illness, and died at 51 without ever being asked what she wanted. A breath. I was 21. I looked at her grave, and I thought, I will not let that be the whole of my story. Whatever else happens, that will not be everything. Frances had stopped writing. I am sorry, she said softly. Don't be. Mary looked back at the manor, at the lit windows, the silhouettes moving inside. She would have liked tonight. She turned back to the young correspondent. Print what you saw, Mary said. Print what I've told you. Not the drama of the ballroom. Any gazette will print that. Print what the schools are. Print what the women in those rooms have done with what they were given. Print that the Queen has noticed. A pause. Let them know it was always about something larger than one man's drawing room. Frances nodded vigorously. And Miss Alderton. Mary's voice was even, but it carried something that made the young woman look up from her notebook. Get yourself into one of those schools, not as a student, as an instructor. You have a gift for listening to what matters. Frances blinked. Ah, yes, ma'am. Good. Mary nodded. Good night. She walked back toward the manor, not through the front door, not back into the ballroom. Around the side to the servants' entrance, she had used 100 times when she wanted to move through her own house without being observed. Inside, she went directly to her study. It was a small room at the back of the house. James had always found this preference of hers baffling when she could have used the larger library, with its commanding view of the front drive. But Mary had chosen this room because it faced east, because it caught the morning light first, and because no one ever came here looking for her. Her desk was covered with correspondence. Letters from parish priests requesting guidance on setting up reading programs. Letters from women who had completed her courses and were now teaching their own daughters. Letters from Lord Ashby and 2 other magistrates in neighboring counties asking for her method to be replicated. She had not shown James any of them. She had not hidden them. She had simply stopped expecting him to ask. Mary sat at her desk and pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her. She wrote 3 letters that night, while the birthday celebration continued in the rooms above and around her. She could hear the music, the laughter, the particular sound a party makes when the central drama of the evening has been digested and people have decided to enjoy themselves regardless. The first letter was to Lord Ashby, thanking him for his years of quiet support and informing him of her intention to accept the royal appointment and to establish the headquarters of the expanded program in a property she intended to purchase in the coming months. The second letter was to the Queen's Secretary, formal gracious, confirming her attendance at court and outlining 3 immediate proposals for the expanded program's first year. The third letter was to her solicitor, Mr. Beckett, a man of impeccable discretion who had managed her personal inheritance quietly for 8 years, the small trust left by her grandmother that James had never thought to inquire about. That trust, carefully invested over 8 years, was now worth considerably more than James knew. Mary had not lied to him about it. He had simply never asked. She sealed all 3 letters and set them in the morning post tray. Then she folded her hands on the desk and sat quietly for a long moment, listening to the party overhead. She thought about the look on James's face when she had read the Queen's letter aloud. She thought about the moment the room had shifted when 200 people had recalculated everything they thought they knew about who held the weight in this marriage. She thought about the woman in Cheddar who had managed grain accounts for 20 years by memory. She thought about her mother. She thought about the letter in her pocket, warm from her body heat, bearing the royal crest. And Mary Pembroke, who had stood straight in a ballroom while her husband announced her disposal, who had read a letter that changed everything, with a hand that did not shake, who had walked out of Fairfield Manor, with the dignity of a woman who had somewhere to be, put her head down on her folded arms, and wept. Not from grief. Not entirely. From the complicated, overwhelming relief of a woman who had been carrying something alone for a very long time and had just been told that the world had noticed. She cried until she was finished. Then she dried her face with practical efficiency, straightened her posture, and reached for the next letter on her correspondence pile. She had work to do. 3 doors down the corridor in the entrance hall. The last guests were beginning to collect their cloaks and call for their carriages. James Fairfield stood in the center of the hallway, shaking hands and accepting goodnight wishes, doing what he had always done, performing ease, performing graciousness, performing the role of a man in complete command of his life. But something was different tonight, and enough people noticed it to make the carriage rides home across Somerset considerably more interesting than they might otherwise have been. James Fairfield's eyes kept going to the corridor that led to Mary's study. The light was on under that door. She was in there, working, writing, being whatever it was that she was, the thing he had never asked about, never followed, never sat down to understand. Lord Ashby paused beside him on the way out. The old man said nothing at first, simply stood. "Fine evening," James offered. Lord Ashby turned his hat in his hands. "I have known your wife for 6 years, Fairfield." "Indeed. She is the finest mind in this county." A pause. "Possibly the finest in 3 counties." James said nothing. "The Queen agrees," Lord Ashby added quietly. He settled his hat on his head. "Good night." He walked out. James stood in the emptying hall. The candles guttered. Down the corridor, the light under Mary's door burned steadily on. He told himself he did not care. He almost believed it. He went to bed. He did not sleep. By morning, Francis Alderton's account of the evening at Fairfield Manor had been written, copied, and dispatched to the Somerset Gazette, the Bath Chronicle. And because Francis was 20 years old, and burning with the particular ambition of someone who had just witnessed history in a ballroom to a contact she had cultivated in London. Within 4 days, the story had reached the capital. Within a week, it was reprinted in the London papers under the headline, "Lady of Somerset, named Royal Advisor, announcement made before birthday gathering of 200. The details of James Fairfield's announcement were included. So were Mary Pembroke's exact words. So was the description of her walking out of Fairfield Manor, with the measured, unhurried steps of a woman who had somewhere to be. The public, as the public always does when a woman refuses to be diminished, made up their minds about this story immediately and passionately. Fan mail began arriving at the Somerset schools. Letters from women in Dorset, in Devon, in Wiltshire, women who had read the newspaper account to their daughters. Women who had sent the clipping to their sisters. Women who had sat with the story in their laps and felt something they did not have an exact word for, but which was something close to recognition. At Fairfield Manor, James received no such letters. What he received was something considerably less comfortable. The county began to see him differently. It happened the way most social recalibrations happen in a small community, gradually, then all at once. Invitations that were slow to arrive. Conversations in the market town that paused at his approach and resumed with a particular energy after he had passed. The magistrate's wife, who had previously been one of his most reliable admirers, who now turned slightly away from him at church and directed her warmest attention quite deliberately toward the woman seated 2 rows behind. That woman was Margaret Hollis, Mary's oldest friend in the county, who had taken to wearing on her lapel a small brooch in the shape of an open book, the symbol of Mary Pembroke's school program. Several other women in the county were wearing it within the month. James noticed. He noticed everything. And for the first time in 37 years of being precisely who he had always been, James Fairfield began to understand that admiration once lost does not come home by itself. Meanwhile, Mary Pembroke packed. She was efficient about it. She kept what was hers, her books, her correspondence files, her grandmother's writing desk, the pressed flower collection she had been building for 15 years. 2 dresses she had made herself, and 4 she had purchased with her own money. She left everything James had given her. Not as a gesture, not as a statement, because she found when she looked at those things that she did not want them. The morning she left Fairfield Manor, it was raining a cold October rain, the kind that comes sideways and smells of iron. She walked down the front steps with her traveling trunk being carried by 2 footmen who had worked at the manor for years and who she noticed could not meet her eyes. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. "Thomas," she said to the elder footman, "your daughter is enrolled in the Cheddar program." "Yes, ma'am." He still wasn't looking at her. "She wrote an excellent essay last month on household budgeting. Mrs. Hobbs sent it to me. Your daughter has a real gift for clear thinking." Thomas looked up then. His eyes were bright. "Thank you, ma'am." "Tell her to stay with it." Mary nodded once. "Tell her the program will continue." She got into the carriage. She did not look back at Fairfield Manor. She was already thinking about what came next. What came next was a modest house on the edge of the village of Rington, rented to begin with, while her solicitor arranged the purchase of a larger property that would serve as both her residence and the headquarters of the expanded program. The Rington house had a good east-facing parlor, a small but functional garden, and a spare bedroom that Mary immediately converted into a second office. On her 3rd day there, she received a visitor. Margaret Hollis arrived with a basket of bread and a bottle of wine and the blunt, bracing energy of a woman who had been waiting years to say something. "You should have left years ago," Margaret announced, setting the basket on the kitchen table. "Probably." Mary was putting the kettle on. "I wasn't ready." "Were you not?" "No." Mary turned around. "I needed to understand what I was leaving for, not just what I was leaving." Margaret considered this. "And now you know." "Now I know." Margaret sat down at the kitchen table. She pulled out the bread and tore it with her hands. An elegant woman with absolutely no patience for unnecessary ceremony. "What will you do?" she asked. "First, travel to London." Mary sat across from her. "Meet with the Queen's secretary, present my proposals, then come back and begin the expansion." She wrapped her hands around her teacup. "I want a program in every county in England within 5 years." Margaret stared at her. "That is ambitious, I know." "I was going to say extraordinary." Mary smiled her real smile, not the one that cost nothing. "Yes," she said, "it is." Outside the Rington house, the October rain had stopped. The light through the east-facing window was pale and clear, and very steady the way light gets after a storm has worked through. Mary Pembroke drank her tea. She had work to do. Margaret left the Rington house as the last light faded from the east window, and Mary sat alone at the kitchen table, with the remains of the bread between them, and the silence of a house that was entirely, completely her own. It was a strange feeling. Not empty. Not lonely. Strange the way a field feels strange after a long harvest when the work is done and the ground is finally still, and you can see for the first time how much has been cleared. She had lived inside James Fairfield's life for 8 years. His house, his name, his calendar of obligations, his schedule of social performances, his particular vision of what a wife was for. She had moved through that life the way a river moves through a channel someone else dug. Not without force, but constrained. Directed. Now the channel was gone. She pulled a fresh sheet of paper toward her and began making a list. Not of grievances. Not of losses. A list of everything she needed to do in the next 30 days, written in the quick, precise hand of a woman who had taught herself to think on paper because thinking alone was too slow for the volume of what needed organizing. She was 3 items deep when the knock came at the door. Not Margaret. Margaret knocked with 2 sharp raps, efficient announcing. This knock was different. 3 hesitant taps, then silence, then 3 more. Mary set down her pen. She opened the door to find a boy of perhaps 12 standing on her step in the rain-damp dark, holding his cap in both hands with the anxious care of someone delivering something important. "Mrs. Pembroke, ma'am." His voice cracked slightly on the ma'am. "Yes, I'm Will Dobbs. My mother is Clara Dobbs. She's in the Cheddar program, ma'am, been in it 2 years." He swallowed. "She sent me with this." He held out a folded note slightly damp at the corners from the walk. Mary took it and read it in the doorway light. Clara Dobbs' handwriting was the careful, deliberate script of a woman who had learned it late and took nothing about it for granted. The note said, "We heard you left the manor. We wanted you to know we're still coming. We will always come. The women of Cheddar." 23 signatures followed. Mary looked at the list of names for a long moment. She recognized every one of them, not just as students, but as people. Agnes with the 3 boys under 5 who came to class with ink on her apron. Ruth, who had wept the first time she read a full sentence aloud and laughed at herself for weeping. Eleanor, who had arrived in that first class, unable to write her own name, and who was now teaching basic arithmetic to her neighbors on Wednesday evenings because she said she couldn't keep something that good to herself. She folded the note and pressed it flat against her palm. "Will Dobbs." Mary looked at the boy. "Is your mother teaching you your letters?" He straightened with a pride that was purely his mother's. "Every night before supper, ma'am. She says education is not a privilege, it's a tool, and tools are meant to be used." That is exactly what she should say. Mary reached into the pot on the entry shelf and produced 2 coins. "For your trouble." "I don't need paying, ma'am. Your mother said to deliver the note and you did. The coins are for the walk back in the dark." She pressed them into his hand with the firmness of someone who has made a decision and does not intend to revisit it. "Tell your mother the program will not stop. Not here, not anywhere. Tell her the only thing that has changed is the address." Will nodded hard enough that his cap nearly fell off. Then he was gone, running back into the dark with the coins in his fist. Mary closed the door. She stood in the entry hall with Clara Dobbs' letter in her hands and felt something knit itself back together inside her chest. Something that had been pulled loose in the ballroom at Fairfield Manor 3 nights ago and had been quietly bleeding ever since. She went back to her list. She wrote faster now. 2 weeks later, Mary Pembroke arrived in London. She had been to London before twice as a girl with her father, once in the first year of her marriage, when James had business with a solicitor there and brought her along because it was expected. She had no particular memories of the city that were her own. Every recollection she had of London was attached to someone else's purpose. This time she came on her own business in a hired post-chaise with her correspondence satchel on the seat beside her and Lord Ashby's letter of introduction in her inside pocket. The city hit her the way it always hit people who came from the countryside. Noise first, then smell. Then the overwhelming sensation of scale of sheer compressed human intention. She had arranged to stay with Mrs. Eleanor Hartley, a widow of 50-something, who ran a respectable boarding house in Bloomsbury, and who had 3 years prior written to Mary after reading a small notice in the Somerset Gazette about the Cheddar program. That letter had begun a correspondence, and the correspondence had become without either woman quite deciding it. Something that resembled friendship, built entirely on paper, which was Mary had long believed one of the most durable kinds. Mrs. Hartley met her at the door with a handshake instead of a curtsy, which immediately made Mary feel that this was going to be a productive visit. "I've followed this business with your husband," Mrs. Hartley announced, taking Mary's bag from the post-chaise driver with the efficiency of a woman accustomed to managing things herself. "The London papers have been talking of very little else." "I know." Mary stepped inside. "I've been trying not to read them." "You shouldn't avoid them. They're almost entirely on your side." "That's precisely why I'm avoiding them." Mary pulled off her traveling gloves. "I don't want my thinking shaped by other people's opinions of me. Not the flattering ones any more than the damaging ones." Mrs. Hartley stopped moving and stared at her. "Good Lord," she said with the tone of someone who has just found exactly what they were looking for and hadn't quite believed it would be real. "You are exactly as I imagined. They had dinner that evening in the boarding house parlor, bread and cold meat, and a very good wine that Mrs. Hartley produced from a cabinet with the air of someone who saved decent wine for occasions that merited it. "Tell me what to expect," Mary said, pouring her own glass before her hostess could perform the formality. From the meeting at court, Mrs. Hartley had it emerged, spent 15 years in London society before retreating to the boarding house, and a life that she described as vastly preferable. She knew the machinery of court and government with the detailed, slightly contemptuous knowledge of someone who had watched it operate at close range for a long time. "They will be polite," Mrs. Hartley said. "They are always polite, especially to women they haven't yet decided what to do with. And then they will ask you what you want. And when I tell them—" Mrs. Hartley's expression was thoughtful. "That depends entirely on whether what you want costs them anything. What do you want precisely?" Mary set down her glass and said it plainly, the way she'd been saying it in her own head for 2 weeks, testing the shape of it. "Funding, not charity investment. I want formal government backing for a national network of women's education programs. I want a budget, a governing structure and legal recognition of the schools as legitimate institutions. Not charitable endeavors run by a well-meaning wife with a private income. Actual institutions." Silence. "Well," Mrs. Hartley said at last, "they are going to be very polite to you indeed. Will they say no? They may." A pause. "The Queen has already said yes. That is not nothing. The Queen has more practical influence in these matters than most people acknowledge, and she has been looking, I think, for exactly this kind of—" she searched for the word, "exactly this kind of vehicle." "I am not a vehicle." "No." Mrs. Hartley raised her glass. "That is exactly the right answer. Give it just that way when they test you." The meeting at court was 3 days later. The Queen's secretary, a neat, careful man named Mr. Forsyth, who gave the impression of someone who had spent 20 years becoming very good at revealing nothing, received Mary in a small anteroom off the formal chambers and offered her tea with the particular graciousness of someone who had been told to be gracious. Mary accepted the tea and did not drink it. "Mrs. Pembroke." Forsyth opened a leather folio. "The Queen has asked me to convey her considerable respect for the work you have accomplished in Somerset. The reach of your program has been remarkable. Thank you. The appointment of Royal Advisor is—" he cleared his throat, "an honorary position, primarily a recognition of achievement, a title." "I understand what you mean by that." Mary set down her untouched teacup. "And I want to be very clear with you, Mr. Forsyth, so that we don't waste each other's time. I didn't come to London for a title." Forsyth looked up from his folio. "I came to discuss the expansion of a program that has already proven its results in 11 parishes across 3 counties. She opened her satchel and produced a document, 12 pages, carefully prepared, bound with a simple ribbon. "Enrollment numbers, literacy outcomes, economic impact assessments. I've measured what these schools produce in real terms. Women who complete the program increase their household income management efficiency by an average of 40%. Women who become instructors develop skills in administration and public speaking that make them leaders in their communities within 2 years." She placed the document on the table between them. "This is not sentiment, Mr. Forsyth. This is evidence." He looked at the document. He looked at her. "You prepared this yourself. Who else would prepare it?" A long pause. "I'll see that Her Majesty receives this." He picked up the document carefully, as if recalibrating its weight. "There will be further meetings." "I expect so." Mary stood. "I'm available for as many meetings as are necessary. I'm staying in Bloomsbury." She named Mrs. Hartley's address. "Please send word when the next meeting is scheduled." She left the anteroom. In the corridor outside, she allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of shaking hands pressed flat against her thighs. Then she straightened her spine and walked toward the exit with the measured, unhurried steps of a woman who had somewhere to be. Back in Somerset, James Fairfield was discovering what it felt like to be talked about in the wrong tone of voice. It had been 3 weeks since the birthday dinner. 3 weeks in which the county had reorganized itself subtly without drama, but absolutely around a new understanding of who Mary Pembroke was and what James Fairfield had done. He sat in his study on a Tuesday morning, a cup of cold coffee at his elbow, and a letter from his solicitor on the desk, and read a passage that required 3 passes to fully absorb. The letter informed him that Catherine Ashworth's father had written to withdraw any expectation of a formal understanding between the families. The baronet's exact language was careful, and polished the language of a man who has consulted his own solicitor before writing, but the meaning was plain. Catherine Ashworth was not after all going to be the next mistress of Fairfield Manor. James put the letter down. He told himself he was not surprised. Catherine was young. Her father was cautious. The county attention would fade, and when it faded, circumstances would resolve themselves. He believed this for approximately 30 more minutes until Thomas knocked on the study door and announced that Lord Ashby had arrived and wished to speak with him. Ashby had never come to the manor uninvited. Not once in the 12 years James had known him. It was not how the old man operated. He worked through letters, through intermediaries, through the careful social choreography of a man who understood that power exercised quietly is power that lasts. Coming here uninvited on a Tuesday morning was a statement. James received him in the drawing room. Ashby sat. He did not take the offered brandy. He folded his hands on his knee and looked at James with the particular expression of a man who has decided to say something difficult and has allocated a fixed amount of patience for the conversation. "You understand, I think, what you've done," Ashby began. "I ended an unsuitable marriage." James kept his voice even. "It is not so uncommon an event." The manner of it was uncommon. "I chose honesty." Ashby looked at him steadily. "You chose an audience." A silence. "There is a difference." Ashby continued, "between honesty and theater. Honest men speak plainly in private. What you did in that ballroom before 200 witnesses on the night a royal letter arrived for your wife, that was not honesty. That was a performance, and the audience has rendered its verdict." James's jaw tightened. "The county's opinion of my personal affairs. This is no longer merely a personal affair, Fairfield." Ashby's voice didn't rise. It never rose. That was what made it effective. "Your wife has been appointed royal advisor. She is in London as we speak, presenting proposals to the Crown. The Somerset Gazette account of that evening has been reprinted in 4 London papers. What happened in your ballroom is now a matter of public record." A pause. James said nothing. "The board of the County Agricultural Trust has asked me to convey that your seat on the advisory committee which your father held, and which you have held for 11 years, will not be renewed at the December meeting." The words landed with the particular weight of things that cannot be untaken. "They gave no formal reason," Ashby added. "They don't need to." James stood at the window. Outside, the grounds of Fairfield Manor spread across the view in their October bareness. The fields turned, the hedges trimmed, everything exactly as it should be. The ordered landscape of a man who owned things and managed them well. It all looked the same. Nothing was the same. "What would you have me do?" James asked. His voice was different now, quieter, less performed. Ashby looked at him for a long moment. "That," the old man said, "is the first genuine question you have asked in this conversation." He rose, settling his coat. "I don't know what to tell you to do, Fairfield. I am not sure there is a thing to do. Some reckonings are not problems to be solved. They are simply consequences." He picked up his hat. "Good day." He left. James stood alone in the drawing room. I thought for the first time in 3 weeks, with something approaching honesty, about the light under Mary's study door. About the way it had burned steadily while he lay awake in the dark above it, trying to believe he did not care. He had not known about the schools. Not truly. He knew she went to the parish hall on Tuesdays, or he had known it once years ago, and it had faded from his attention the way things fade when you stop considering them important. He had not known about the 40 women in Cheddar, about the instructors she had hired with her personal income, about the 11 parishes, about Lord Ashby's involvement, about the Crown's attention. He had not known because he had not asked. He had not asked because he had assumed there was nothing there worth asking about. He sat back down. He picked up the letter from Catherine Ashworth's father again. He put it down without finishing it. He was beginning in the slow and painful way of a man whose certainties are being unwound from the outside in, to understand that assumption is not the same thing as knowledge, and that a man can live in a house for 8 years with someone he has never truly looked at. Mary's second meeting at court was not with Mr. Forsyth. She was received by the Queen's private secretary, an older man, higher rank, the kind of man who conducted important conversations, and beside him unexpectedly sat a woman Mary had never seen before. She was perhaps 60, with white hair, and the bearing of someone who had spent decades being the most competent person in whatever room she occupied without receiving any formal recognition for it. She wore no ornament except a small pin on her lapel, an open book unmistakably, one of the Somerset school symbols. Mary looked at it. The woman saw her look and said with the directness of someone who had earned the right to skip preamble, "My name is Lady Constance Norwood. I established the first formal lending library for women in Mayfair 12 years ago, with my own funds and considerable opposition. I have been following your program for 18 months. Her Majesty thought we should meet." "Yes," Mary said. "I think so too." Lady Constance smiled, brief, decisive. "Sit down, Mrs. Pembroke. Tell me what you need." What followed was 2 hours of the most energizing conversation Mary Pembroke had experienced in 8 years of marriage. Lady Constance was formidably intelligent and rigidly practical. She had no interest in sentiment, considerable interest in evidence, and a network of connections across London and the home counties that made Lord Ashby's considerable influence look local. "The problem," Lady Constance said, marking something in her own document, "is not convincing the Crown. The Queen is already convinced. The problem is the men who control the actual budget allocation, who will want this to be smaller than you intend, more ceremonial than functional, and easier to ignore than you plan to make it. I have considered this. Have you considered that they will attempt to attach a male administrator above you in the governance structure?" Mary looked at her directly. "They can attempt whatever they like. The program exists because I built it. The evidence base is mine. The relationships with the parishes and the instructors are mine. Without me, they have a title and a building. The program is not transferable." Lady Constance set down her pen. She studied Mary across the table with an expression that was almost not quite, but almost warm. "I have been waiting for someone exactly like you," she said, "for 12 years. I hope the wait was not too uncomfortable." It was interminable. Lady Constance picked up her pen again. "Let's talk structure." They talked for another hour. By the end of it, the outline of what would become the National Program for Women's Education had been sketched across 4 sheets of paper in Lady Constance's decisive hand, annotated in the margins with Mary's precise additions. Neither woman mentioned James Fairfield. His name did not arise. It was not relevant. Tag. The Somerset Gazette ran a second article, 3 weeks after the first. This one written by Francis Alderton, with considerably more space and considerably more detail. It described Mary's London meetings, quoted Lord Ashby and Lady Constance, and included near the end a passage from one of the women in the Cheddar program, Agnes, the woman with 3 boys under 5, who had given Francis a quote in the kitchen of her farmhouse between stirring a pot and feeding the youngest. Agnes had said, "Mrs. Pembroke taught us that knowing how to read your own accounts is knowing how to read your own life. I didn't understand that before. I thought the numbers were my husband's business. Now I know they're mine. Everything is mine if I learn it." The article was reprinted in London within the week. Lady Constance sent Mary a copy with a note in the margin. "This is your best argument. Keep her talking." Mary sent Francis Alderton a note of her own. "You are exactly as I thought. Come see me when I'm back in Somerset." She was back in Somerset within the week, carrying 3 letters of preliminary government commitment in her satchel, and a dinner invitation from Lady Constance, written on paper, so fine it was almost translucent. The house in Rington had been quiet in her absence. She came home to a stack of correspondence that reached the middle of the kitchen table. Letters from women in counties she had never visited asking how to begin, who to contact, what the first step was. She sat with the stack for an evening and answered every one of them. It took most of the night. She did not mind. By the time the lamp began to gutter, she had written 46 replies, each one personal, each one specific to the woman who had sent it, each one containing the same essential information embedded in different forms, depending on what the letter had told her about its writer's particular situation and need. This was the part of the work. Nobody saw the part that happened late at night at a kitchen table in Rington, the part that had no audience and no witness and no applause. Just Mary Pembroke and a stack of letters from women who were trying to find a way toward something better, and a lamp that was running low on oil, and a hand that kept moving because the alternative was to stop. She was sealing the last envelope when she heard the noise at the garden gate. A carriage. Stopping. A voice she recognized not from warmth, but from long familiarity. The way you recognize a sound you have heard every day for years, even when you didn't know you were listening. James. She sat very still. The gate opened. Footsteps on the path. His particular footsteps heavier on the left than the right, from an old riding injury he had never had properly treated. A knock at the door. Not 3 hesitant taps like Will Dobbs. 3 firm knocks. Then waiting. Mary looked at the stack of sealed envelopes. She looked at the lamp burning low. She looked at the 46 letters she had written through the night for women she had never met, because they needed someone to tell them the first step. She stood. She crossed to the door. She opened it. James Fairfield stood on her step in the dark, his hat in his hands, and he looked. She noticed this immediately, and with a precision born of 8 years of close observation, he looked as though something had broken in him, and he hadn't yet decided whether to try to fix it or simply learn to carry the pieces. Mary. His voice was different than it had been in the ballroom, stripped of the performance. She waited. I need to speak with you. She looked at him for a long moment. Behind him, the hired carriage stood at the gate. His driver, not Thomas, one of the younger footmen, was carefully not watching the door. It's past midnight, Mary said. I know. The morning would be more appropriate. I know that too. He looked at her directly. I've been sitting in that carriage outside your gate for an hour, trying to decide whether to knock. A pause. What decided you? The lamp, he said quietly. You've been in there all night working. I know that lamp. You used it in the study at the manor. A beat. I realized I've seen that lamp more times than I've sat down and talked to you. And I didn't know what that meant until it was too late to mean anything different. Mary studied his face in the doorway light. She looked for the calculation she had learned to recognize in him, the performance, the management of impression. She was very good at reading him. She didn't find it. What she found instead was something rawer, less formed. Something that might have been real. Come back at 9, she said. We'll have coffee. I'll hear what you have to say. She closed the door. She leaned against it for a moment in the dark hall. Then she went back to the kitchen table, sealed the last envelope, and extinguished the lamp. In 3 hours, it would be morning. She had letters to post, a meeting to prepare for, and a program to build. James Fairfield could wait until 9. He had, after all, kept her waiting for 8 years. He came back at 9. Mary heard the carriage on the road before she heard the gate. She had good ears, always had the kind of hearing that comes from years of paying attention to things other people had stopped noticing. She was at the kitchen table with her coffee and her correspondence. When the wheels slowed and the horse settled and she did not get up, she poured a second cup, set it across from her own, and waited. The knock came at 3 minutes past 9. Firm. Punctual. James had always been punctual. She would give him that without hesitation. She opened the door. He looked as though he had not slept. The careful grooming was intact. James would maintain the grooming in a shipwreck. It was reflexive, but the flesh beneath it had the particular quality of a man who had spent the night sitting with thoughts he couldn't outrun. There were shadows under his eyes that had not been there a month ago. His coat was well cut but worn, which told her he had dressed himself this morning without the valet's full attention. Small details. She noticed all of them. Come in, Mary said, stepping back. He came in. He looked around the kitchen, the correspondence stacked in neat piles, the 2 cups on the table, the lamp from Fairfield Manor's study that he had recognized through the window the night before. He did not comment on any of it. He sat where she indicated and wrapped his hands around the coffee cup and said nothing for a moment, which was unusual enough for James that she let it breathe. "I went to the Cheddar Parish Hall," he said at last. Mary looked up from her own cup. "3 days ago. I wanted to see it." A pause. "I told myself it was idle curiosity." "Was it?" "No." The word came out stripped of everything except its meaning. "I wanted to understand what I had been living beside without knowing." Mary waited. "There were 32 women in that room," James continued. "At 9 o'clock in the morning. Farmers' wives, a blacksmith's widow, 2 women who walked more than 4 miles to get there. One of them had an infant strapped to her back." He stopped. He set down the cup. "They were learning accounting principles. The instructor was 26 years old. She ran the session like a barrister runs an argument, precise, patient, expecting competence from the room. That would be Sarah Hobbs," Mary said. "She was one of my first students. She didn't know who I was." A muscle worked in his jaw. "Or she knew and chose not to acknowledge it, which I suspect is the more likely interpretation. She was entirely focused on her students. The work in the room was—" He stopped again. "It was serious, Mary. It wasn't a charity endeavor. It wasn't ladies doing good works to fill an afternoon. It was serious work conducted with complete seriousness by women who were treating it as exactly what it was. Which is what? Their education." He said it the way a man says something he should have said years ago and knows it. Their actual real education, not a courtesy, not a supplement, the thing itself. The kitchen was quiet between them. "You built that," James said, "while I was—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. "While you were looking at other things," Mary completed it for him without heat. "Yes." He looked at her directly. In 8 years of marriage, she could count on one hand the number of times James Fairfield had looked at her with genuine openness, without strategy, without performance, without the particular armor a man wears when he is most concerned with how he appears. This was one of those times. It made him look considerably younger and considerably less certain, and she noticed this with something that was not quite grief and not quite tenderness, but was in the territory of both. It made him look like the man she had married before the years between had changed the shape of things. "I want to understand how I missed it," he said. "You didn't miss it," Mary answered. "You didn't look. That's the same thing." "It's not." She set her cup down. "Missing something suggests it was hidden. I didn't hide it. I talked about the program at dinner for the first year. I showed you the enrollment numbers in the second year. I tried to explain what Sarah Hobbs was accomplishing, and you told me it was admirable, and then asked whether I'd spoken to Cook about the Thursday menu." She said it without accusation, simply as record. "It wasn't hidden, James. It was present. You had decided it wasn't worth your full attention, and so you didn't give it full attention, and what you don't attend to disappears not from the world, but from your version of it." He absorbed this without defending himself, which cost him something visible. "I don't know how to fix it," he said. "You can't fix it." Her voice was not unkind. "You can only understand it, and perhaps in some future life with someone else do differently." The word future landed between them like a stone dropped in still water. The ripples went outward for a moment, touching everything in the room. "Is there truly no possibility?" "No." Mary's voice was quiet. Absolute. The word wasn't a door slamming. It was a door that had simply always been closed, that she had simply finally stopped pretending might open. "I need you to understand that my no is not anger. It is not punishment. I do not hate you, James. Hating you would require me to invest in you, a feeling I no longer have available." He flinched. "What I have," she continued, "is clarity. I understand now with a precision I didn't have 3 years ago or even 3 months ago who I am and what I am capable of and what I need in order to be those things fully. What I need is not Fairfield Manor. It is not the county's approval of my choice of husband. It is not permission from any man, including you, to do the work I am going to spend the rest of my life doing." James was very still. "I need space," Mary said. "Physical space, legal space, and the kind of interior space that a woman loses slowly when she spends 8 years fitting herself into the shape of someone else's life." She folded her hands on the table. "The divorce proceedings will go through Mr. Beckett. He will be in contact with your solicitor. Mary, I will not revisit this. Not harsh, just certain. You came here this morning because you needed to say something, and I have given you the space to say it, and I am glad you came, because what you said matters. The fact that you went to Cheddar, the fact that you saw it, the fact that you understood something true. That is not nothing, James. It is in fact considerably more than I expected. A pause. But understanding something too late is still too late. He picked up his hat from the table. He turned it in his hands the way a man turns something when he is looking for something to do with his hands that isn't what he actually feels. The county seat, he said. The advisory committee. Ashby told me. I know. The Ashworths. I know that too. I deserve it all. He said it with a flatness that was more convincing than regret would have been. I want you to know I know that. I believe you. Mary stood. And I want you to know something in return. She moved to the kitchen counter and lifted a document that had been sitting face down since the previous night. She placed it in front of him. This is the proposal I presented to the Crown, the national program, its structure, its budget, its governance. She set it before him. I am telling you this not because you have a role in it, you don't, but because you asked this morning to understand what you had been living beside. So understand it completely. This is what was growing while you were looking at Catherine Ashworth's ribbons. James looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked it up and read the first page, then the second. He read with the focused attention of a man who manages a large estate and understands organizational structures and financial proposals. She had always known he was intelligent. It had never been the question. He set it down. This will work, he said with the blunt certainty of a man who knows what he's reading. The structure is sound. The funding argument is unassailable. If the Crown commits 1/10 of what you've outlined, the program becomes self-sustaining within 3 years. I know. You knew when you wrote it. Yes. He stood. He picked up his hat. He looked at her across the kitchen table, across the 2 coffee cups, the lamp from his study, the stacked correspondence from women and counties. She had never visited the proposal that would reshape the landscape of women's education across England. I am sorry, James said. Not with performance. Not with the polished edges of an apology prepared in advance. With the raw, awkward, insufficient sorry of a man who has finally understood the size of what he is apologizing for and knows the word doesn't cover it. I know, Mary said. He left. She listened to the carriage pull away down the road and disappear into the ordinary sounds of a November morning in Somerset Crow's wind, someone's cattle moving in a nearby field. She sat back down. She picked up her correspondence. She kept working. The formal divorce proceedings took 11 weeks, which was, Mr. Beckett informed her, with the dry precision of a man who had seen worse, remarkably efficient, given the social complexity of the parties involved. Mary signed the final documents on a Thursday in January 1816 in Mr. Beckett's Taunton office with Margaret Hollis as her witness. Margaret, who had worn the open book brooch every day for 3 months without being asked, who had organized a dinner for 6 of Mary's most committed supporters. The week of the London meetings, who had sent Mary a letter the night of the birthday dinner that read simply, I always knew. I am so proud of you. Margaret handed her the pen and squeezed her hand once hard and said nothing because nothing was needed. Mary signed her name. Mary Pembroke, not Fairfield. She had made that decision before the ink was dry on the separation agreement, and she had communicated it to Mr. Beckett with a clarity that brooked no negotiation. She had been Mary Pembroke for 21 years before she had been Mary Fairfield. She intended to be Mary Pembroke for the rest of her life. Walking out of Mr. Beckett's office into the January cold, she felt the complicated lightness of something enormous that has finally been set down. Not happiness precisely. Something more durable than happiness. The particular relief of alignment, of being at last exactly who you actually are, with no gap between the interior and the exterior, no performance required, no fitting required. Coffee, Margaret asked. Yes, Mary said. And then I need to review the budget proposal. The government liaison is coming to Rington on Friday. Margaret looked at her with the expression of someone who has known a person long enough to recognize when they are choosing work over feeling, and who has also known them long enough to understand that sometimes, for some people, work is not avoidance. It is the feeling. It is the thing itself. "Coffee first," Margaret said. "Then the budget." "Coffee first," Mary agreed. The government liaison was a man named Mr. Aldous Pierce, dispatched from the Home Office with the particular bearing of a bureaucrat who has been sent to manage something he considers peripheral. He arrived in Rington on a gray Friday morning and was received in Mary's east-facing parlor, which she had arranged with 2 chairs, a writing table, and nothing else. No flowers, no decorative distraction, nothing to suggest this was a social call. Pierce was perhaps 50, with the careful assessing eyes of a man accustomed to deciding things. He looked at the parlor. He looked at Mary. He looked at the document she placed in his hands before he had fully settled into his chair. "The proposal," she said. "I assume Mr. Forsyth forwarded the original. This is the revised version incorporating the Queen's Secretary's feedback from our December meeting." Pierce opened it. He read. He had the professional's ability to absorb a document quickly, and Mary waited with the patience of someone who has made her argument in writing and knows it is sound. "The budget allocation in year 1, Pierce said after several minutes. "It's larger than the Home Office anticipated. It is appropriate to the scope of the program." "The scope of the program is considerable." "Yes. For a..." He paused, visibly selecting his word. "For a women's program," Mary supplied with perfect neutrality. Pierce cleared his throat. "For a first initiative of this kind." "It is not the first initiative of this kind," Mary said. "It is the first initiative of this kind to arrive with 11 parishes of evidence, 3 years of documented outcomes, and a letter of personal endorsement from the Queen." She opened her own copy of the proposal to page 7. "The literacy outcomes in Cheddar alone represent a measurable shift in household economic management across 40 families. That is 40 families who are now more financially stable, more capable of managing agricultural leases and household accounts, more resistant to the kind of debt cycles that ultimately cost the county in poor relief. This program is not charity, Mr. Pierce. It is infrastructure." Pierce looked at page 7. He read it twice. "You wrote this yourself," he said. "I did." "The economic analysis." "I studied the household accounts of my participants over 3 years and cross-referenced with county poor relief records." Mary kept her voice even. "The methodology is in the appendix, page 14. He turned to page 14. The room was very quiet while he read. "Lady Constance Norwood is listed as a co-presenter," he said eventually. "Lady Constance is co-chairing the governance board." Pierce set the document on his knee. "Lady Constance has another careful pause, a considerable reputation for tenacity." "She does." A slight pause. "So do I, Mr. Pierce, though I suspect you have not yet had sufficient opportunity to observe it directly." Something shifted in his expression. Not warmth, but recalibration. The look of a man who has entered a room expecting one kind of negotiation and is realizing midway through that he is in a different kind entirely. "There will be resistance," he said, "from certain members of the Home Office. The budget size, the governance structure, the fact that the Oversight Board is majority female. The Oversight Board is majority female because the program serves women, and the people best positioned to make decisions about what women need are women." Mary's voice was pleasant and completely immovable. "I am happy to have that conversation with whoever in the Home Office wishes to have it. I am also happy to have Lady Constance have it. She has been having it in various forms for 12 years, and she is considerably more patient than I am." Pierce looked at her. "Are you suggesting I should find you the less formidable option?" "I am suggesting you should find me the straightforward option." Mary leaned slightly forward. "Mr. Pierce, I am not here to make your life difficult. I am here because 40 women in Cheddar Parish changed the trajectory of their families by learning to read their own accounts. I am here because 11 parishes want to do what Cheddar has done. I am here because the Queen has written me a letter, and I intend to honor what that letter represents, not by having a title, but by building something real." A pause. "I need your office's support to do it at national scale." You need someone who has actually built this kind of program and proved its results in order to defend the budget to the Treasury. We need each other. I am simply more aware of this than you have been so far." The silence that followed was the particular silence of a room in which someone has been entirely accurate and the other person is deciding how to respond to accuracy. Pierce closed the proposal. He opened it again. He turned back to page 7. "I will need 2 weeks," he said, "to take this through the relevant channels. Of course. There will be a second meeting, possibly a third. I am available. Lady Constance will also be available." Mary stood signaling the meeting's conclusion with the graceful authority of someone who has decided when the conversation is over. "I look forward to the next meeting, Mr. Pierce. Mr. Beckett will see you out." Pierce stood. He gathered the proposal. At the door he paused. "Mrs. Pembroke." Something had shifted in his tone. Not warmth exactly. He was not a warm man, but the particular respect of someone who has genuinely been impressed and is being in his way honest about it. Off the record. "Yes. There are men in the Home Office who will vote against this program on principle, not because the evidence is weak, because the evidence is strong, and it comes from a woman who knows it is strong, and that is, he searched for it, uncomfortable for them." "I know," Mary said. "You seem unsurprised." "I have been building this for 8 years without approval from men who found it uncomfortable." She met his eyes. "I have some practice with the condition." Pierce nodded once, put on his hat, and left. Mary stood in the empty parlor. Then she went directly to her writing table and wrote 3 pages of notes on the meeting, while every detail was still precise and fresh in her mind. Pierce's hesitations, his recalibrations, the exact phrases he had used when testing her, the moment the dynamic had shifted, what she needed to prepare before the next meeting. She was 3 pages in when Frances Alderton knocked at the parlor door. Frances had, in the 2 months since the birthday dinner, transformed herself with the particular efficiency of a young woman who has been given a clear direction and the energy to sprint toward it. She was now Mary's. She resisted every formal title Mary attempted to assign, but the function was indisputable: her correspondent, her documenter, her keeper of public record. "How did it go?" Frances asked. "Well," Mary kept writing. "He's a careful man. Careful men can be worked with if you're patient." "Are you patient?" "When the work requires it." Mary signed her name at the bottom of the 3rd page. "He'll push back on the budget. We need the women in Cheddar to be available for a site visit, probably March. I want Pierce to see it running, not read about it running." Frances was writing in her notebook. "Clara Dobbs's daughter has just enrolled." She offered, still writing. "She's 17. Clara told me she intends to be an instructor herself within 2 years. Mary stopped. Clara's daughter. She said it was because her mother came home from class one evening and read her the household accounts out loud and explained every line. She said she'd never understood before that those numbers told a story. She said she wanted to learn to read every kind of story there was. Mary was quiet for a moment. "Put that in the next article," she said. "I already did." Of course she had. 3 weeks after Pierce's visit, the twist came, and it came as the significant ones always do, from an angle Mary had not anticipated. A letter arrived from London. Not from Mr. Forsyth. Not from Lady Constance. From a woman named Mrs. Dorothea Marsh, whose name Mary did not recognize, written on paper that suggested considerable wealth. "Dear Mrs. Pembroke, you will not know my name. I know yours. I have followed your program through the papers and through my own channels of inquiry, and I write to you now with something I believe you deserve to know." Mary read the next paragraph twice. Mrs. Dorothea Marsh was Catherine Ashworth's aunt. She was also, and this was the part that required the second reading, a founding member of a women's educational trust that had been operating quietly in London for 7 years, funding private tutors for women who could not access formal instruction, conducting its work entirely beneath the attention of polite society, because Mrs. Marsh wrote bluntly, "Public attention has a way of making men want to control things that women have been managing perfectly well without them." The trust had 43 members. Combined, their private resources were substantial. Mrs. Marsh was writing to offer Mary a partnership. Not the government kind, Not the kind that came with Pierce's careful hesitations and committee reviews and men at the Home Office who found competence in women uncomfortable. The other kind. The kind that moved quickly, asked no permission, and answered to no one except its own membership. We have been waiting. Mrs. Marsh wrote for someone with what you have. Evidence of public mandate and the particular quality of not requiring anyone else's approval to proceed. We can move where the government cannot. We can fund what they will delay. We can reach women in parishes that the Crown's bureaucracy will not prioritize for years. Mary read the letter a third time. She sat with it for a long time. Then she did something she had learned to do. In the past months, she walked to Margaret Hollis's house, which was 12 minutes on foot, and sat at Margaret's kitchen table and read the letter aloud. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Mary loved most about her. She's Catherine Ashworth's aunt, Margaret said when she was done. Yes. That's either a complication or an irrelevance. It's an irrelevance, Mary said. Catherine Ashworth is a girl of 23 who wore ribbons James bought her. Mrs. Marsh is 60 and has been running an educational trust for 7 years. They are not the same thing. No, Margaret agreed. They are certainly not. She poured more tea. What do you want to do? I want to meet her. Mary folded the letter. I want to look at her books. I want to understand what she has built, and whether it is real, and whether our methods are compatible. And if they are, then we become very difficult to stop. Mary's voice was not triumphant, it was simply accurate. The government process will take months, years possibly. There will be committees and reviews and men at the Home Office deciding whether women who can read their own accounts are a reasonable use of public money. Meanwhile, in every county in England, women are managing grain accounts by memory and raising children without understanding that the numbers they're reciting have a language they were never taught. She pressed the letter flat on the table. I am not willing to wait. Margaret looked at her across the table. You have changed, she said, not as criticism, as observation. No. Mary met her eyes. I have become more completely myself. That looks like change from the outside. A pause. James thought the same thing. He said I seemed different, certain. He found it surprising. James always found certainty in women surprising. Yes. A slight pause. I was certain when I married him. I had simply learned very gradually to make myself smaller than I was in order to fit. I did not notice it happening until I was quite small indeed. Margaret's expression was the careful one, the one that meant she had something to say and was deciding whether to say it. Say it, Mary told her. I should have done more. Margaret wrapped her hands around her teacup. When I could see it happening, year by year, I should have. What would you have done? I don't know, something. Margaret shook her head. Knocked on the study door, asked you directly, something more than watching. You wrote me letters. Mary's voice was steady. You never pretended everything was fine. You always asked me questions that required honest answers. Some of them I gave honestly, and some I didn't, and that was my choice, not your failure. Mary, Margaret, firm but warm. The person responsible for what happened in my marriage is the person who chose to stay in it, past the point of usefulness, which was me, and the person who chose to perform, rather than see with. A long silence. Mrs. Marsh, Margaret said finally. Write her back today. I intend to. Mary wrote to Mrs. Marsh that evening. She wrote 3 drafts, something she rarely did because the first 2 were technically correct and emotionally wrong, either too formal or too eager, and neither reflected the precise tenor she wanted to establish with a woman she suspected would read every word closely and draw accurate conclusions from each one. The 3rd draft was right. She knew it when she read it back. It was the letter she would want to receive if she were Mrs. Marsh. She sent it that night with the evening post. 4 days later, she received a reply. Mrs. Marsh wrote 7 lines, which was Mary would later understand entirely. Characteristic, come to London. Wednesday, next 11 o'clock. 14 Grosvenor Square. Bring your evidence. Leave your caution at home. I don't have time for it, and neither do you. Mary showed it to Francis Alderton, who read it once and said, I want to meet this woman. You will, Mary told her. Eventually. Can I come to London? Not this time. Mary folded the letter. This time, I go alone. She went to London on Tuesday. She stayed again with Mrs. Hartley, who had followed every development in the papers with the focused attention of someone who had invested early in a stock she knew was good. Grosvenor Square, Mrs. Hartley said when Mary told her the address. You know it. I know the house. Mrs. Hartley's expression was thoughtful. I know of Mrs. Marsh. Not well, but enough. A pause. She is not easily impressed. Good, Mary said. Neither am I. Wednesday morning arrived cold and clear. Mary walked to Grosvenor Square in her best traveling coat, carrying her satchel with the evidence documents and the proposal and 3 months of correspondence that represented the full documented history of what had been built in Somerset. The house was large and well kept and entirely unadorned with the kind of decorative excess that suggested wealth trying to prove itself. The door was answered by a housekeeper, who was Mary noticed roughly 60 years old, and moved with the authority of someone who had been trusted with significant responsibility for a very long time. Mrs. Pembroke. The housekeeper stepped back. Mrs. Marsh is expecting you. She was led through to a room that was entirely books on 3 walls and entirely windows on the 4th. Mrs. Marsh sat behind a desk of considerable age and obvious working condition. Not a decorative desk. A desk where real work happened and rose when Mary entered. She was precisely what her letter had suggested. 60 perhaps, with white hair and eyes that assessed rather than observed. She wore no jewelry except the open book pin which Mary had half expected, and she extended her hand not in the delicate social manner, but flat and firm, the handshake of a woman who had decided she was done performing femininity for anyone's comfort. Sit down, Mrs. Marsh said. Tell me what you've built and how you built it and what's gone wrong and what you need. Skip the version you've been telling the government. I want the real one. Mary sat down. She took a breath. And then she told the truth. Not the proposal version, not the 12-page document version, but the actual version. The first 6 women in the Cheddar Parish Hall. The personal income she had spent for 3 years without telling James the night she had understood that what she was building would outlast her marriage, even before she had admitted to herself that her marriage was ending. The terror of the birthday ballroom, the steadying weight of the royal letter, the loneliness of being right about something important for years without having anyone who fully saw it. She talked for nearly an hour. Mrs. Marsh did not take notes. She listened with the absolute focused attention of someone who has learned that the best use of an intelligent mind is sometimes simply to receive what another intelligent mind is offering. When Mary finished, the room was quiet. My niece wore his ribbons, Mrs. Marsh said. Not an apology, a statement of fact acknowledged without flinching. I know. She's young. I know that too. He is not a bad man, Mrs. Marsh said. Simply a man who believed his own importance rather too completely. We have enough of those. She picked up Mary's evidence document. This is extraordinary. It is real, Mary said, which I believe is better. It is. Mrs. Marsh opened the document. I am going to ask you a question, and I want your honest answer. All right. If the government delays, if Pierce comes back with half the budget, a compromised governance structure, and a male administrator over the board, do you walk away and build it privately, or do you accept the compromise and spend the next 5 years fighting from inside? Mary had thought about this. She had not known until this moment that the answer was fully formed. I don't accept the compromise, she said. Not on governance. The board stays as designed, or I build it privately with the resources I can secure, and the government can choose to partner with something that's already working, rather than something they've controlled from the start. Mrs. Marsh looked at her for a long moment. You understand that is a significant risk. I understand that accepting a compromise structure is a more significant risk. A program managed by a man who finds women's competence uncomfortable will not do what this program needs to do. Mary held the older woman's gaze. I am not interested in a program that exists on paper. I am interested in a program that works." Something opened in Mrs. Marsh's expression, briefly controlled, but real. "The trust," she said, "has 43 members and combined resources sufficient to fund the first year of your national expansion, independently of any government commitment." She leaned forward. "If Pierce comes back with a compromise that undermines your governance, we fund it ourselves, and we make it so successful that the government comes back to us. And if Pierce comes back with what I've asked for, then we partner with the government funding and double it." Mrs. Marsh extended her hand again. "Either way, Mrs. Pembroke, you will not be doing this alone." Mary looked at the hand. She thought about the first 6 women in the Cheddar Parish Hall. She thought about Clara Dobbs's note with 23 signatures. She thought about Will Dobbs on her doorstep with his cap in his hands and his mother's handwriting pressed into his palm. She thought about Agnes managing grain accounts for 20 years by memory because no one had given her the language for what she already knew. She thought about her mother. She took Mrs. Marsh's hand. "No," Mary Pembroke said, "I will not." Outside the windows of the Grosvenor Square house, London moved in its ordinary enormous way. Carriages and voices, and the relentless press of a city that did not stop for anyone's private reckonings. Inside, 2 women sat across a desk covered in documents, their hands clasped across a partnership that neither of them would ever call by anything so small as a triumph. It was simply the next step. It was simply what came next. And neither of them had any intention of stopping. Mrs. Marsh's housekeeper brought tea at noon, and neither woman touched it. They had been talking for 2 hours. Not the careful, managed conversation of a first meeting between strangers performing goodwill, but the fast, efficient exchange of 2 people who have recognized in each other a matching quality of mind and have no intention of wasting the discovery on pleasantries. The evidence documents were spread across the desk. Mrs. Marsh's own ledgers had been retrieved from a locked cabinet and opened alongside them. Numbers spoke between them in the precise language of women who had both learned by different routes that facts are the most reliable armor available. "The Wiltshire parishes," Mrs. Marsh said, tracing a column with her finger. "You've had 3 requests for replication. What's holding them back?" "Instructors." Mary leaned forward. "The program in Cheddar works because Sarah Hobbs is exceptional. Replication requires women who are trained to teach, not merely educated themselves. We need a training pipeline before we can expand responsibly. Which costs £1,200 in year 1. I have the breakdown on page 9. Mrs. Marsh turned to page 9. She read it. She made a mark in the margin. "The trust can commit 800 in the first quarter," she said. "The remaining 400, if Pierce gives you anything workable, comes from the government allocation. That leaves the instructor housing unresolved." "Not entirely." Mrs. Marsh closed the ledger. "I have a property in Dorset sitting unused. It was my mother's. 4 bedrooms, functional kitchen, good east light." She said it the way practical women say things, as a resource assessment, not a sentiment. "It would house 6 instructors in training at a time. You could begin the pipeline immediately." Mary looked at her. "You are offering this freely. I am offering it purposefully. There is a difference." Mrs. Marsh's voice was dry, but not unkind. "I have a great deal of money, Mrs. Pembroke, and no children who will inherit it, and considerable impatience with the idea of it sitting in accounts, earning interest while women 40 miles away are calculating grain yields in their heads because no one ever gave them paper." She closed the ledger. "Use the house. Use the trust. Let us see what we can build." The word "build" landed between them and resonated in a way that the word "triumph" or "victory" would not have, because build implies work still ahead. Effort still required, mornings still to be gotten through. It was the right word. They both knew it. Mary left Grosvenor Square at 2 o'clock with Mrs. Marsh's signed commitment letter in her satchel and a list of 14 items to act on before the end of the month. She walked back toward Bloomsbury in the January cold, with the particular energy of someone who has just had a meeting that changes the shape of what is possible, and she walked fast because the cold required it, and because the list in her head was moving faster than her feet. She was 3 streets from Mrs. Hartley's boarding house when she heard her name. "Mrs. Pembroke." She turned. A man she did not immediately recognize, then did. Younger than James, similar build, the family resemblance, unmistakable. Edward Fairfield. James's younger brother, who had spent the past several years in Scotland, managing a property their father had left in complicated legal status. They had met perhaps 4 times in 8 years of marriage, always at the manor, always briefly. He looked uncomfortable in the particular way of someone who has prepared for a conversation and is uncertain of its reception. "Mr. Fairfield." Mary stopped. Her voice was neutral, not cold, but offering nothing. I had some business near here." He paused. "I saw you from across the street." Another pause. "I wanted to say, I don't want to presume, and if you'd rather not hear it, I understand entirely, but I wanted to say that what you did at that dinner was—" He stopped, tried again. "What James did was wrong. I want you to know I've told him that directly." Mary looked at him. Edward had always been the quieter brother, less certain of himself, more observant, with a quality of genuine consideration that James had somewhere lost, or perhaps never possessed in the same measure. "I appreciate that," she said. "How is he?" The question surprised him. She saw it move across his face, the recalibration, the recognition that she had asked from genuine concern rather than strategy. "Honestly?" Edward met her eyes. "Not well. Not broken, he's too stubborn for that. But changed. He's very quiet. He let Thomas go from the stables last week and then hired him back the next day because apparently he couldn't think of a justification for it that held up under scrutiny." A pause. "He's been reading about educational reform." Mary blinked. "He ordered 6 books from London," Edward said. "On women's education, on institutional reform. He won't say why. Thomas told me. Thomas tells me most things now, I think, because he's relieved to have someone to talk to who isn't James sitting alone in the library." A beat of silence. "I don't know what that means," Mary said. "I'm not sure either." Edward turned his hat in his hands. "I don't think he knows either. I think he's trying to understand something, not to get you back. I don't think he's foolish enough to think that's possible. More like trying to understand how he got to be someone who would do what he did." Mary stood with that for a moment. The cold pressed at her cheeks. Somewhere down the street a vendor was calling out the price of hot chestnuts, and the ordinary city moved in its ordinary way, entirely unconcerned with the particular weight of this conversation on this corner. "Tell him," she said at last, "that the understanding is worth having regardless of what he does with it. And tell him—" She paused, finding the words with care. "Tell him that Sarah Hobbs has recommended the Fairfield Parish Hall in Cheddar for a second classroom. If the hall committee agrees, the program will be using a building that was part of the Fairfield estate before it was sold to the parish. He can think what he likes about that." Edward stared at her. "You're not doing that as a—" "I'm doing it because the hall has the right room size and the right location for the women who need it," Mary said simply. "The history of the building is the history of the building. The work is the work." Edward Fairfield looked at her for a long moment, with an expression she couldn't fully name. Something like admiration, something like sadness, something like the complicated emotion of watching a person be exactly who they should be, and knowing that a chance to be part of that has passed. "Good day, Mr. Fairfield," she said. "Good day, Mrs. Pembroke." He stepped back. "Good luck." "I don't need luck," Mary told him not unkindly. "I need Pierce to come back with a reasonable budget and 43 women in London who are as organized as I think they are." She turned. "But thank you." She walked the remaining 3 streets to Mrs. Hartley's, with Edward Fairfield's account of James sitting in his library with 6 books on educational reform turning in her mind. She held it carefully, not with warmth, not with renewed hope, but with the particular attention she gave to things that were real and that deserved to be acknowledged as such, without being allowed to change anything that had already been rightly decided. Pierce came back in February, not with a letter. In person, unannounced, which told her something about the nature of what he was bringing. Announced visits carry negotiating positions. Unannounced ones carry either bad news or something the visitor doesn't want on record as a formal communication. Mary received him in the Rington parlor on a Thursday afternoon, when she had been midway through reviewing the Dorset instructor housing plans that Mrs. Marsh's property manager had sent. She did not put the plans away. She left them on the writing table and sat across from Pierce with them visible at her elbow, which was not accidental. Pierce looked at the plans. He recognized what they were, or recognized that they were plans of some kind, the evidence of work in progress. His expression shifted. "You've been moving forward," he said. "The program doesn't stop because the government is considering whether to join it." Mary folded her hands. "What does the Home Office have for me, Mr. Pierce?" He opened his case and produced a letter. He set it on the table between them, but kept his fingers on it. "The budget," he said, "has been approved at 60% of your request." 60%. She ran the calculation immediately. It was insufficient for the full first-year plan, sufficient for a reduced version, enough to establish the framework without the reach. "The governance structure," Pierce continued, "has been approved as written with one amendment." Her eyes went to his. "What amendment?" "A government liaison position, non-voting, observational only, present at board meetings to report to the Home Office on program progress." She studied him. "Non-voting." "Non-voting," he confirmed. "No authority over programming decisions, no veto, observer status only." This was, she recognized the compromise she had told Mrs. Marsh she would reject if it touched governance. But a non-voting observer was not governance interference. It was surveillance of a mild-kind bureaucratic instinct, the government's need to feel it had eyes on what it was funding. "Who is the liaison?" "That is to be determined." "I want approval over the appointment." Pierce paused. "That is not standard." "I am aware. I am asking regardless." Mary kept her eyes on his. "I will not have someone in that room who is there to undermine rather than observe. If the Home Office nominates someone I have reason to believe is operating in bad faith, I need the ability to object formally. Non-binding objection, if you prefer. I will put it in writing that my objection is non-binding, but I want it on record." Pierce was quiet. "You understand," he said carefully, "that asking for approval over a government appointment is a significant request." "I understand it is unusual." She did not soften it further. He looked at the plans at her elbow again. He was calculating she could see at the arithmetic of what she had, and what the government had, and what each party needed from the other. "I'll take it back," he said, with a recommendation that it be granted. Something in Mary's chest released a tension she had been holding since the meeting had started. "What is the timeline for formal commitment?" 4 weeks, possibly 6. "And in the interim, does the program continue?" "The program continues," Pierce said. That was never in question. After he left, Mary sat at her writing table for a long time without picking up a pen. 60% was not what she had asked for. The liaison was not what she had asked for. But the governance was intact. The board was intact. Sarah Hobbs and Lady Constance and Mrs. Marsh and 23 women from Cheddar with their signatures on a damp piece of paper. All of that was intact. She picked up her pen and wrote to Lady Constance, then to Mrs. Marsh, then to Lord Ashby. Then she wrote to Francis Alderton, "Come to Rington tomorrow. We have something to write about." Frances arrived at 8 the next morning with her notebook and an expression of someone who has been waiting for exactly this kind of summons. Mary told her about Pierce's visit, the budget, the governance, the observer position. Frances wrote quickly, asking sharp questions at intervals that made Mary understand, not for the first time, what a genuinely good correspondent this young woman was becoming. 60%, Frances said. "Is that a victory or a compromise?" "It's both." Mary poured the coffee herself, set a cup at Frances's elbow. "Most real things are." "What does Lady Constance say?" "I haven't heard back yet. I wrote last night." Mary sat. "What I know she'll say is that the 40% gap gets filled by the trust which has the resources for it, and that having government backing at 60% is worth more than full private funding alone, because it establishes the program as a national institution rather than a private charity." Frances wrote that down, underlined something. "And the observer is manageable if the appointment is right." Mary wrapped her hands around her cup. "Possibly even useful. An observer who genuinely understands the program and reports honestly to the Home Office is better than no presence at all. It means there's someone in those meetings who has actually seen the work. You're going to try to make them an advocate. Mary looked at her. I'm going to make the program so undeniably effective that everyone who comes into contact with it becomes an advocate, including the government's observer. A pause. That is not strategy. That is simply what happens when the work is real. Frances set her pen down. She looked at Mary with the particular attention she reserved for moments she intended to remember. Can I ask you something personal? She said. You may ask. When you were in that ballroom, when Mr. Fairfield made the announcement. Frances chose her words carefully. Did you know then what was going to happen, that everything you built was about to? I didn't know it would happen as it did, Mary said. I knew the letter was coming. I knew what was in it. She was quiet for a moment. What I didn't know was whether I had the courage to use it the way I used it, whether I would stand there and let the moment pass, let him have the narrative, or whether I would... She stopped, started again. I made that decision in about 30 seconds. What decided you? Mary thought about it, really thought about it the way she rarely had time to do with the question so directly put. Agnes, she said finally. I thought about Agnes. About her coming to class with an infant strapped to her back and learning to read her own accounts and going home to teach her children. I thought about what it would mean to those women if I stood in that ballroom and did nothing. If I let him announce my disposal and I walked out quietly and the story became woman set aside by wealthy husband. Full stop. She set her cup down. They deserved better than that story, all of them. Agnes, Clara, Ruth, Sarah, every woman who had walked into that parish hall. She looked at Frances directly. I needed the story to be something they could carry. Something that said you are not peripheral. You are not a footnote. What you are building is the main event. Frances was not writing anymore. She was simply listening. Write that, Mary said. I already have it. Frances touched her temple. In here. Lady Constance's letter arrived the following week, and it was characteristically direct. 8 lines. The trust was prepared to fund the remaining 40%. The observer position was acceptable provided the nomination protocol included a formal review by the board. She had, without being asked already, contacted 2 of her political connections about the liaison appointment, and had a candidate in mind, a woman, a widow, with 15 years of experience in charitable administration, who was, Lady Constance wrote, not the kind of person who has ever found women's competence surprising, which is a more important qualification than anything on her formal record. Mary read the letter twice. Then she did something she rarely did in the middle of a working day. She laughed. Not the managed laugh of social performance. The real one, sudden and genuine, and slightly startled, the laugh of a person who has been working in the dark for a long time and has just seen with full clarity the shape of what's being built in the light. She sent Lady Constance's candidate's name to Pierce the same afternoon with a 2-line note expressing her support for the nomination. Pierce wrote back in 3 days. The candidate was approved. Her name was Mrs. Jane Caldwell. She arrived at the first board meeting in March with the same open book pin and a file of her own notes on the program, and she sat in the observer's chair and listened with the complete attention of someone who takes what she hears seriously. And at the end of the meeting she said, I have 3 questions, and asked them with a precision that told every woman in the room that this was going to be in fact useful. March also brought the site visit. Pierce came to Cheddar on a gray Wednesday, gray sky, gray mud on the road, the kind of March day that Somerset specializes in all damp and persistence. He came with a junior colleague from the Home Office named Mr. Harding, who was young and had the slightly glazed expression of someone who had been told what to expect and had not quite believed it. Sarah Hobbs was running the session when they arrived. 38 women. The room was full and warm and working. Sarah was at the front with a chalkboard, figures, columns, the language of accounts made visible. She did not stop when Pierce and Harding came in. She nodded at them, indicated 2 chairs at the back, and continued. What Pierce watched for the next hour was this 38 women ranging in age from 17 to 61, engaging with mathematical concepts, with the concentrated attention of people who understand that what they are learning is not abstract. Agnes was in the third row, her youngest on her lap. Now that the infant could sit up, the child watching the chalkboard with the alert interest of someone who had been attending these sessions from birth and perhaps absorbed something through proximity. Clara Dobbs sat in the second row with her daughter beside her, and at one point Sarah asked a question, and Clara's daughter answered it before her mother did, and Clara turned and looked at her daughter with an expression that required no words. Harding, Mary noticed, had been writing in his notebook since 20 minutes into the session and had not stopped. Pierce said nothing during the session. He watched with the stillness of a man who has suspended judgment in order to actually see something. Afterward, Sarah Hobbs walked them through the curriculum documents in the anteroom. She was 26 years old, and she explained the program's structure with a fluency and authority that precluded any condescension, not through defensiveness, but simply through competence, so self-evident it left no space for doubt. "How many graduates are now teaching elsewhere?" Pierce asked. 14, Sarah said. "In 4 parishes. 3 more are being trained currently. The retention rate women completing the full curriculum, 83%. Sarah didn't hesitate. The dropout rate is almost entirely explained by life events, childbirth, family illness, seasonal agricultural demands. Women who are able to complete the program complete it." Pierce turned to Harding. Harding was still writing. On the carriage back to Taunton, Pierce sat across from Mary and was quiet for several miles. The countryside went past in its damp gray March way, and neither of them spoke, and Mary let the silence go as long as it needed to, because she had learned that some silences are productive, and this one had the quality of a man working something through. "Mrs. Caldwell was right," Pierce said finally. Mary waited. "She told me before this visit that the site visit would be the moment. That whatever I thought I understood about the program from the documents, I would understand something different here." A pause. "She was right." "She usually is," Mary said. "The 40% funding gap." Pierce looked out the window. "I'm going to recommend it be covered by the government allocation." Mary went very still. "The Home Office cannot commit the full amount immediately, but I believe I can structure a supplementary allocation that covers the remainder within the fiscal year." He looked at her. "It would mean the Trust's contribution becomes reserve funding rather than primary, a contingency rather than a necessity." Mary absorbed this. Full government funding. Governance intact. Observer in place and already proving useful. The 40 women in Cheddar. The 14 graduates teaching in 4 parishes. Mrs. Marsh's property in Dorset, with its good east light and its 6 bedrooms for instructors in training. Lady Constance and her network of 43. Frances Alderton and her notebook and her instinct for what mattered. Lord Ashby, who had told her years ago that her work had not gone unnoticed. All of it at once in that carriage on a gray March road. She pressed her hands flat on her knees to keep them steady. "Thank you," she said. It was simple. It was the only thing to say. "The program is extraordinary," Pierce said. "That is not a compliment. That is a finding." He turned back to the window. "It should have been funded years ago." Mary looked at the March countryside going past and thought, yes, it should have. And it wasn't because the people who hold the money have to see the work before they believe in the work, and no one would look when it was just a woman in a parish hall on Tuesday mornings. But they were looking now. The formal government commitment was signed in April, not in London. Mary had requested with the particular boldness that was becoming her signature mode that the signing happen in Cheddar, in the parish hall, at 9 o'clock in the morning when the women's class was scheduled to begin. Pierce had agreed, which surprised her slightly. Mrs. Caldwell, the observer, had not been surprised at all. She told Mary at the board meeting the week before the signing, "I suggested it to him. He thought it was his idea by the time he agreed." She said it with the dry precision of a woman who has spent 15 years working around the edges of institutions. "It's a useful skill." "I'll learn it from you," Mary said. "You already have it," Mrs. Caldwell told her. "You've been doing it since February." The morning of the signing, the parish hall at Cheddar was full, not just with the enrolled women. though they were all there, including Agnes, with her youngest, now standing and holding her mother's skirt, and watching the proceedings with the wide attention of a child who has grown up understanding that what happens in this room matters. Clara Dobbs and her daughter sat in the front row. Ruth, who had wept the first time she read a full sentence aloud, sat with her back very straight, and her hands folded in her lap, and her chin lifted. Lord Ashby was there. Mrs. Marsh had come from London, arrived the night before, stayed at the Rington house at Mary's insistence, eaten bread and cold meat at the kitchen table, and talked until midnight about what came next. Lady Constance had sent a letter to be read aloud, which Frances Alderton read on her behalf in a clear voice that reached every corner of the room. Frances herself was there, notebook open, writing everything. Margaret Hollis stood at the back wearing the open book pin and the expression of someone watching something they knew was going to matter for a long time. Pierce signed the document at the front of the room. Then he handed the pen to Mary. She signed her name, Mary Pembroke. The room 38, women and their children, and Lord Ashby and Mrs. Marsh and Margaret Hollis and Frances Alderton broke into something that was not quite applause and not quite cheering and was entirely itself. Warm and real, and the sound of people who understood what they were celebrating without needing anyone to explain it. Sarah Hobbs, standing beside the chalkboard, put her hand over her mouth for a moment. Then she straightened because the session was scheduled to begin at 9, and it was now 9:12, and the work did not stop for its own celebrations. "All right," Sarah said to the room, "shall we?" And 38 women sat down, and the class began. Mary stood at the side of the room and watched and felt not triumph, not arrival, something more like the recognition of a waypoint on a longer road. This was not the end. It was the structural moment. The moment when what had been personal became institutional, when what had been built by one woman's determination became something larger than any single determination. She thought about her mother. She thought about what it would have meant for her mother, that brilliant, uncredited woman, to have had access to something like this. To have had a room where her intelligence was assumed rather than tolerated. To have had language for the things she already knew how to do. She could not give that to her mother, but she could give it to Agnes's children. She could give it to Clara's daughter, who was already teaching her neighbors, and who intended with 17-year-old certainty to become an instructor herself within 2 years. She could give it to the women in Wiltshire who had written letters asking what the first step was. The first step was this room, these women, this morning. She left the parish hall at 10:30 and walked not to the Rington house, but further to the road that ran east out of Cheddar toward open country. She needed air and space and the particular quiet of moving without destination. She had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard the horse. She knew before she turned. James. I was riding alone, no groom, no companion. He pulled the horse to a walk and came alongside her and did not dismount immediately, which told her this was not a planned interception. He had seen her from the road and made a decision in the moment. She stopped. He dismounted. For a moment, they stood on a Somerset road in April, with the horse between them and the sound of crows in the distance, and the ordinary morning going on around them, without caring what this moment was. "I heard about the signing," James said. "Not congratulations, just acknowledgement. Word travels quickly. Thomas told me. He was there. He went on his own. I didn't send him." A pause. "He came back and told me the whole of it. Sat in my library and told me about the women and the chalkboard and Clara Dobbs's daughter." James looked at her directly. He had the expression of someone who has seen something that settled something for him. Mary nodded slightly. "Sarah Hobbs does that to people." "You did that to people?" James's voice was quiet and stripped of everything except its meaning. "You built something that does that to people." She said nothing. "I've been reading, he said. "Edward mentioned." He blinked. "You spoke to Edward?" "In London, in January. He was very kind." James absorbed this. "I've been reading everything I can find on women's education reform, on institutional structure, on what programs like yours there are others smaller on what makes them work." He stopped. "I've been trying to understand it. Not to, I know there's nothing to fix between us. That's not what this is." "What is it?" He was quiet for a moment. "I think it's penance. he said finally. Or maybe it's just what you do when you understand you were wrong and the wrongness was substantial. You try to become someone who wouldn't be wrong in the same way again. He looked at her. I'm not sure it has a name. Mary looked at him. This man she had known for 8 years, who had announced her disposal to 200 people, and sat in his library reading books about women's education in the months that followed, who had ordered 6 books from London and let Thomas tell him about the cheddar signing and ridden out alone on an April morning. It has a name, she said. It's called understanding. Most people resist it. It is to your credit that you haven't. He nodded, looked away, looked back. The Parish Hall, he said. The Fairfield Hall, Sarah Hobbs. It's the right room. Mary kept her voice even. The history of who owned the building before the parish is the history of who owned the building. It doesn't change the room. He flinched slightly, absorbed it. Is there anything? He started. No. Quiet. Absolute, but not cold. There is nothing, James. That answer will not change. But I want you to know that is not anger. It is not punishment. It is simply what is true. She held his gaze. You understanding what you lost does not create an obligation for me to help you feel better about having lost it. You understanding is its own good. It's worth having. But it is yours. He nodded. His jaw worked once. Forgiveness, he started. I forgave you in February, Mary said. In the sense that I released the weight of it. Not for your sake, for mine. She kept her voice even and honest. Forgiveness is not the same as return. Forgiveness means I no longer carry your choices as a wound. It does not mean I forget the shape of them. A long silence. Was there a moment, James asked very quietly, when you were still in the marriage? A moment where I could have... Yes. She answered without hesitation because it was true, and truth was what she could offer. There were many moments. Before Catherine. Long before Catherine. The moments where you chose to look at something more interesting than what I was building. Any of those moments done differently would have changed things. She paused. You chose not to look. Each time you chose not to look. And now you are looking, and the thing you are looking at is complete without you. The horse shifted beside them. The crows called from somewhere further off. The April road was quiet and very ordinary. James Fairfield picked up his reins. I hope it goes well, he said. The program, everything that comes next. It will, Mary said. Not arrogance, simply knowledge. He mounted. He looked down at her once with the expression of a man carrying something he will carry for a long time and has made his peace with the weight of it. Then he rode back toward Fairfield Manor. Mary watched him go. She stood on the road until the sound of the horse faded. Then she turned back toward Rington. She had letters to write. 46 women in Wiltshire were waiting to know what the first step was. She turned back toward Rington with 46 women in Wiltshire waiting on her answer, and the April road was ordinary under her feet, and James Fairfield was already becoming what he would remain, a chapter that had shaped her without defining her, a weight she had carried, and set down a man who had looked away too long, and was now learning to look at things he could no longer touch. She did not look back. There was no need. The letters to Wiltshire took 2 days. Not because she was slow, but because she was precise, and precision takes the time it takes. Each letter was specific to its recipient. Each one contained the same essential information in a different frame, calibrated to what the woman's original letter had told her about her particular situation, her particular barriers, her particular quality of readiness. Mary had learned over 4 years of correspondence that the first step is not the same for everyone. For some women, the first step is a room. For some, it is permission. For some, it is simply knowing that someone with authority believes they are worth the effort of a personal reply. She gave each of them what they needed. When the last envelope was sealed, Frances Alderton appeared at the kitchen door. She had taken to appearing at intervals throughout the day, the way a good correspondent does, present when useful, absent when not, with an instinct for the difference that Mary had stopped marveling at and simply relied upon. The Gazette wants a full profile, Frances said without preamble, setting her notebook on the table. Not a news piece, a profile, your story, how you built it, Where it goes from here. She looked at Mary directly. They're offering the front page. Mary looked at the stack of sealed Wiltshire letters. When? They want it for the May edition. I'll need to approve the copy before it goes. Frances looked briefly offended. I would not submit anything without your approval. I know. Mary softened it. I meant I'll need time to review it carefully. There are parts of this story that are mine to tell, and parts that belong to the women in those classrooms. I won't let one blur into the other. Frances sat down and opened her notebook. Then tell me how to separate them. They worked for 3 hours. Frances asked questions that were better than most. She had the gift of asking the thing underneath the thing. The question that required the real answer rather than the practiced one. Mary gave her the real answers because Frances had earned them, and because the May edition of the Somerset Gazette was going to reach women in counties where the program had not yet arrived, and every one of those women deserved to understand that this was something they could have. Not someday. Now. The title, Frances said near the end. I want your input. You're the writer. And you're the subject, and I've learned enough about you to know you'll have an opinion. Mary looked at her. Something that puts the women first, not me. Every time my name leads, it suggests this is about one exceptional person. It's not. It's about what happens when ordinary people get access to what they should have had all along. Frances wrote something in her notebook and underlined it. I have a question, Frances said in the different tone she used when she was asking something personal. About the road yesterday, about Mr. Fairfield. Mary was quiet. I saw you, Frances said simply. From a distance. I wasn't following. I was walking back from the Dobbs farm. I didn't intrude, but I saw him right away. A pause. Are you all right? Yes. Mary meant it. I am genuinely thoroughly all right, which is a different thing from easy. She pulled the last sealed envelope toward her. He's reading books on educational reform. Frances blinked. James Fairfield. 6 of them, ordered from London. Frances was very still. What do you make of that? I make of it that understanding once begun tends to be thorough. Mary set the envelope with the stack. It changes nothing between us. But it is not nothing. A man who chooses to understand what he chose not to see is doing something real. It just isn't something I'm part of. And that doesn't. No. Clear, gentle, final. It doesn't. The chapter is closed. Understanding doesn't reopen a closed chapter. It just means you carry it differently. Frances wrote that down. Mary suspected she would find those words in the May edition. She found she didn't mind. The twist that Mary had not anticipated came not from London, not from Pierce or Lady Constance or the Home Office, but from a direction so unexpected that when Margaret Hollis brought the news to the Rington house on a Thursday morning in late April, Mary simply stood in the kitchen for a moment and said nothing at all. She's enrolling, Margaret said, at the Shepton Mallet program, the one that opens in June. She set the newspaper on the table. She wrote to the enrollment coordinator herself. The name in the newspaper was Catherine Ashworth, not as James's almost companion, not as a baronet's daughter, as an applicant for the women's education program in Shepton Mallet. The newest of the Somerset sites opened 4 weeks earlier, with trust funding and a graduate of the Cheddar program as its instructor. Catherine Ashworth was 23 years old and had written in her enrollment letter Frances had obtained a copy through means that Mary chose not to examine too closely, that she had attended a society dinner in London in March, at which Lady Constance Norwood had spoken about the program, and that she had found herself understanding for the first time that education was not something that happened to you in childhood and was then finished. That it was an ongoing condition available to be continued at any point by any woman willing to pursue it. She had also written that she was aware of the complicated history connecting her name to the program's founder, and that she understood if that history made her enrollment inappropriate. The enrollment coordinator had written back, "There is no complicated history here. There is only a woman who wants to learn. Come in June." Mary read the letter twice. Margaret watched her face. "Well," Mary said at last. "Indeed." Margaret agreed. She's 23. She is. She wore his ribbons at the birthday dinner. She did. Margaret paused. She was also 22 at the time, and in love with a man who bought her ribbons and told her she was extraordinary. That is not a crime. It's a condition of being young and not yet knowing enough to see clearly. Mary looked at the letter. She thought about who she had been at 22. Not Catherine, not with ribbons, but young enough and certain enough and wrong about enough things that she had chosen a man who looked at her with admiration and mistaken the looking for seeing. The enrollment stands, Mary said. That was never a question. She set the letter down. But I want to know when she's there, when she's in that classroom. I want her treated exactly the same as anyone else. No special attention, no awkwardness, no awareness on the instructor's part of who she is in relation to me. The instructor in Shepton Mallet is young, Margaret said. She may not know the history. Good. Mary pushed the letter aside. Then there's nothing to manage. Margaret sat down at the kitchen table. She had been sitting at Mary's kitchen table in various kitchens for 17 years, since they were both girls in their father's houses in the same county, and she had the ease of someone who belongs somewhere without needing to be invited. You're going to be extraordinary, Margaret said. Not a prediction, an observation of what was already true. I'm going to be useful, Mary corrected. Extraordinary is what people call you when they want to imply you're unusual. Useful is what actually matters. She sat across from her oldest friend. Every woman in those classrooms is extraordinary by your definition. What they needed was to be useful, to have their intelligence used, their time respected, their capability assumed. She folded her hands. That is all the program does. It assumes they are capable and creates the conditions for them to prove it. Everything else follows from that. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Your mother, she said. Yes, Mary said. Every day. May arrived with the Somerset Gazette's front page and everything that followed from it. Frances's profile ran across 4 columns with the title, Built Without Permission. How 40 Women Changed the Shape of Women's Education in England. The opening paragraph was about Agnes, about the infant on her back, and the chalkboard, and the grain accounts managed by memory for 20 years, and it did not mention Mary Pembroke until the 4th sentence. It was exactly right. The response was immediate and overwhelming, and came from places no one had predicted. Letters from Scotland. A letter from a woman in Ireland who had read the reprinted version in a Dublin paper. Letters from women who ran private schools who wanted to affiliate. Letters from men, husbands, brothers, fathers, who had read the article and wanted to know how to support a wife or sister or daughter in attending. Mrs. Caldwell, the Government Observer, sent a note from London. The Home Office has received 14 formal inquiries from county magistrates about replication programs. I am managing them. You will receive formal communication within the month. Prepare your expansion proposals. Lady Constance wrote, I told you. 2 words. Nothing else. It was from Lady Constance, a celebration. Mrs. Marsh wrote a longer letter, characteristically direct. The Trust has had 4 new membership applications since the Gazette profile. All accepted. We are now 47. The Dorset House is ready. The first instructor cohort arrives June the 3rd. I expect you will visit. I will be there, Mary wrote back. June the 3rd. But before June. Something happened in May that Mary had not planned for and could not have anticipated, and it arrived as the significant things kept doing in the form of a letter. This one was handwritten on paper. She recognized the cream stock kept in the library at Fairfield Manor, the one James had used for personal correspondence since she had known him. She recognized his hand before she had fully registered the return address. She sat with it unopened for 10 minutes. Then she opened it. It was not an apology. He had already given her his apology on her doorstep at midnight in November, and she had received it, and he knew better than to repeat what had already been said. It was also not a plea James had understood on the April road, that pleading was not available to him and had the dignity not to attempt it. It was a letter of a kind she had not expected. He had been approached. He wrote by a property developer in Bath who had made an offer on a building on the eastern edge of Taunton, A large functional space previously used as a wool merchant's warehouse, now vacant and for sale. James had been asked to co-invest. He had turned it down. He had then, using his own funds without informing any other party, purchased it himself. How was offering it to the National Program for Women's Education outright, as a gift in perpetuity, with no conditions attached, no expectation of acknowledgement, and no request for any relationship to the program beyond the transfer of the deed. I am aware. He wrote that this cannot correct what I did. I am not offering it as correction. I am offering it because it is the right building in the right location for what you have described as your next expansion need, and because I read your May edition proposal, and the Taunton corridor is exactly as you identified a gap in the current network. I have no use for the building. You do. That is the whole of my reasoning. You told me that understanding is worth having, regardless of what you do with it. I am attempting to do something with it. I am not asking for a response. Mary set the letter on the table. She sat very still. She had not allowed herself to expect anything from James Fairfield. Not from the November midnight visit, not from the April road, not from the 6 books on educational reform. She had received each of those things as information about his internal reckoning, and had held them carefully at a distance from anything that touched her own plans. This was different. This was the Taunton building. The Taunton building was not a gesture. It was not sentiment. It was exactly what he had said it was, the right building in the right location, identified by someone who had finally, too late, begun to actually read what she had written. It would take 3 months of negotiation and legal procedure to acquire through any other means. He had done it in, she checked the date on the letter, 11 days. She picked up a pen. She wrote 3 sentences. I have received your letter. The deed should go to Mr. Beckett directly. He manages all program property. Thank you. She did not write, I forgive you. She had told him in February, forgiveness was not for his comfort. She had given it, and it was done, and there was nothing more to give. She did not write, this changes things. Nothing had changed. The chapter was closed. She wrote what was true. The deed should go to Mr. Beckett. Thank you. She sent it that afternoon. She told Mrs. Caldwell about the Taunton building the following morning. Mrs. Caldwell said, how was it acquired? By donation. From whom? Mary paused for exactly 1 second. A private donor who prefers not to be named. Mrs. Caldwell looked at her with the precise reading expression of a woman who has spent 15 years working in institutional environments and recognizes discretion when she sees it. I see, she said. The building is sound. The location is right. The deed will be clean. Then it is a good donation, Mrs. Caldwell said, and moved on. June the 3rd, the Dorset instructor training cohort arrived. Mary had driven from Rington before dawn, arriving at the house as the first instructor candidates were coming through the gate. 6 women between the ages of 22 and 45 from 4 different counties, each one a graduate of a different program site. Each one carrying what she had learned and willing to spend 3 months learning to give it to others. Mrs. Marsh was already there. She had arrived the night before and had, by the look of her, been awake since 5, organizing things that were already organized, which was her particular expression of enthusiasm. They're early, Mrs. Marsh said, watching the women come through the gate. Good instinct. Mary watched them too. The ones who show up early are the ones who can't wait. The first woman through the gate was 22, with ink-stained fingers, and the particular expression of someone who has been wanting something for so long that arriving at it feels slightly unreal. She stopped just inside the gate and looked at the house and breathed. Mary knew that breath. She had taken it herself in October in Cheddar, standing in the parish hall before the first 6 women arrived. The breath that says this is real. This is actually happening. She crossed the garden. Welcome, she said. I'm Mary Pembroke. The young woman turned. She was perhaps trying to look composed and not quite managing it, which Mary found considerably more endearing than composure would have been. I know, the young woman said. I read the Gazette profile 3 times. A pause. I'm Hannah Reese, from the Shepton Mallet program. Another pause. I learned to read at 20, Mrs. Pembroke. I mean properly read. I knew my letters before. But reading everything, accounting, history, correspondence, that was the program. She stopped herself. "I'm sorry. That's a great deal to put on a greeting." "No," Mary said. "That's exactly what a greeting should contain." She extended her hand. "I'm glad you're here, Hannah." Hannah Reese shook it with the slightly excessive firmness of someone who wants to convey seriousness and has not yet calibrated the amount required. The other 5 came through the gate in pairs and alone, and Mary greeted each of them, and the introductions were real, not ceremonial, not performed, but the real kind where people actually register each other. Mrs. Marsh watched from the doorway with an expression that was for her considerably warmer than usual. By 9 o'clock, all 6 were settled in the house. By 10, the first training session had begun with a curriculum. Mary and Lady Constance had developed together over 3 weeks of letters and 2 days in London in May, sitting across Mrs. Hartley's parlor table with the windows open and the city going on outside and the work going on inside. The way it always went on steadily, specifically with no gap between what was intended and what was done. The training session that morning was run not by Mary, but by Sarah Hobbs. Sarah had arrived from Cheddar the evening before, had slept in the guest room with the east light, and had come to the breakfast table with her curriculum notes and the particular focused energy of someone who has been given a task they are exactly suited for and knows it. She ran the first session with the same fluency and authority she brought to the Cheddar room, and the 6 instructor candidates engaged with her, the way students engage with teachers who respect them, not passively, but back and forth, questioning and building and arriving together at understandings that were better than what any one of them had brought in. Mary sat in the back and watched. She thought about the night 8 years ago when she had stood in the Cheddar Parish Hall and looked at 6 women who couldn't write their own names and felt the full frightening weight of what she was attempting. She thought about Agnes. She thought about Clara Dobbs's note with 23 signatures. She thought about Will Dobbs on her step in the rain dark, holding his cap in both hands. She thought about the ballroom at Fairfield Manor, and the letter with the royal crest, and the 200 witnesses, and the sound of the crowd shifting its understanding all at once, like a field turning in the wind. She thought about Mrs. Marsh, and Lady Constance, and Frances Alderton, and Margaret Hollis, and Lord Ashby, and Pierce, and Mrs. Caldwell, and Hannah Reese, with her ink-stained fingers, and her 3 readings of the Gazette profile. She thought about James, sitting in the library at Fairfield Manor, with 6 books he had ordered from London, trying to understand the shape of what he had been living beside without knowing. And she thought about her mother, the brilliant, uncredited woman who had died at 51 without anyone having asked her what she wanted, and she thought I asked. I kept asking. Even when the asking had no audience. Even when the answer was built in a room that no one important was looking at. I asked what I wanted, and I built it. And now, 6 women are sitting in a room learning how to teach others what they know, and 46 women in Wiltshire are waiting for the first step. And Hannah Reese read a newspaper article 3 times because she needed to know this was real. It is real. It was always going to be real. It just needed someone willing to build it before anyone told them they could. Late that afternoon, when the first training session had ended, and the instructor candidates were in the kitchen with Mrs. Marsh reviewing the evening reading, Mary stepped out into the garden. The light was long and golden in the particular way. June light is long and golden in the English countryside, unhurried, spreading across the garden with the ease of something that has all the time in the world. Mary stood in it with her hands at her sides and her eyes closed for a moment, breathing the June air, feeling the weight of the day settle into something she could name. Her feet were solid on the ground. Her hands were her own. Her name was her own. Everything she had built was still standing. She heard the garden gate and turned. Frances Alderton notebook, slung over one shoulder, slightly out of breath from what had evidently been a faster walk than she had planned. "I rode from Rington," Frances announced. "Mrs. Hollis said you'd left before dawn and I thought—" She stopped, looked at the house, looked at Mary. "How did it go?" "Well," Mary said. "Come inside. I'll tell you everything." Frances did not move immediately. She stood at the gate looking at Mary with that particular attention she deployed when she was seeing something she intended to keep. "You look different," Frances said. "I'm the same." "No." Frances shook her head. "Not different from before. Different from 3 months ago. 6 months ago. She struggled for it. You look like someone who has put something down. Mary considered this. Yes, she said. That's accurate. What did you put down? Mary thought about the April road and James riding back toward Fairfield Manor. She thought about the November midnight and the sealed letters and the lamp burning low on oil. She thought about the ballroom and the royal letter and the 30 seconds in which she had made the decision that changed the shape of everything after. The weight of needing to prove it to anyone who didn't already believe, she said. I carried that for a long time, longer than I realized. She looked at the house, at the golden light in the windows, at the sound of 6 women inside, learning to teach what they knew. I don't need to carry it anymore. The proof is in the room. Frances wrote something in her notebook. Then she looked up and said, What comes next? Mary turned back toward the house. Wiltshire, she said. Then Derbyshire. Then the Taunton building opens in September. Mrs. Caldwell has 14 county magistrates waiting. Lady Constance has the London expansion ready to file. She moved toward the door. Lady Norwood is speaking at Parliament in October. They've asked her to address the Education Committee. She's asked me to prepare her evidence document. That's everything you wanted. It's everything I planned for, Mary corrected. What I want keeps growing. That's the nature of the work. She opened the door. Come inside, Frances. There's a great deal to write. Frances followed her in. The door closed on the June garden, with its long golden light and its ordinary evening sounds, and inside the house in Dorset. The work continued as it had continued through 8 years of a marriage that didn't see it through a night of sealed letters, when the lamp ran low through a London winter of meetings and negotiations, and 43 women in a trust, and 6 instructor candidates arriving at a gate. The work continued steady and specific, and entirely unimpressed with whatever anyone thought of it. It had never needed permission. It had never needed an audience. It had needed one woman willing to begin, and another willing to learn, and another willing to teach, and another willing to write it down, and another willing to sign her name, and another willing to walk 4 miles on a Tuesday morning, because the thing being offered in that room was worth the walk. 40 women had become hundreds. Hundreds would become thousands. And in every room, in every parish, in every county, where a woman sat down to learn the language of her own life, the accounts, the letters, the arithmetic, the clear, precise story that numbers tell when someone finally gives you the key to read them in every one of those rooms. Something had been planted that would outlast every ballroom announcement, every man who chose not to look, every year spent fitting into a shape someone else had decided was appropriate. Mary Pembroke had not left her marriage because she stopped loving. She had left because she had finally completely learned to love the right thing first. Herself. Her work. The 40 women and the 6 instructor candidates, and the Wiltshire letters, and the open road to every county that hadn't yet had its Tuesday morning. She had learned to love what was real, and everything real she had ever built was still standing.